There is a word for what Robb Stark did. The maesters would call it diplomacy. The singers would call it romance. The lords of the north, the men who had crowned him and bled for him and followed him south because the south had taken their lord, the northern lords would call it something else. Madness, because the girl across the narrow sea was a Targaryen, and the north had bled to overthrow the Targaryens. And the blood was still wet on the ground when the boy king who wore the crown that blood had purchased looked east, past the Riverlands and past the Crownlands and past the sea itself, and saw what every lord in his war council had dismissed as irrelevant, a girl with 3 dragons and no kingdom, sitting on a stolen throne in a city most Westerosi could not find on a map. Robb Stark saw her. And Robb Stark, the boy who thought like a wolf and fought like a storm and governed like a man twice his age, Robb Stark saw the war that the dragons could win, and the peace that the marriage could build, and the future that neither the wolf nor the dragon could reach alone. The North called it madness. The North was not wrong. But madness and brilliance share a border, and the border is outcome, and the outcome is the story. This is the story. The news. What crossed the narrow sea before the ships did? The news came to Riverrun the way all news came during the war, late, incomplete, and wrapped in rumour thick enough to obscure the truth it carried. Sir Brynden Tully brought it. The Blackfish, the veteran whose network of riders and informants and river traders operated beneath the war's surface, as roots operate beneath a tree, invisible and essential. The Blackfish had spent 30 years building what armies could not build and gold could not buy. A web of men who owed him favours, and who repaid those favours with information. The information arrived on a morning in the Riverlands, late summer. The kind of morning where the mist sat on the Red Fork like a grey blanket, and the camp woke to the sound of horses and steel, and the 10,000 small noises that an army produced when the army was awake and the war was waiting. "There's a girl in Slaver's Bay," the Blackfish said. "In the war room, the chamber in Riverrun, where House Tully had governed the Riverlands, and where House Tully's grandson now governed a war. The table was covered in maps, the Westerlands, the Crownlands, the Reach, the maps that showed where the fighting was, and where the fighting would be. The maps did not show Essos. The maps did not show Slaver's Bay. The maps did not show what the Blackfish was about to describe. A girl, Robb repeated. The king in the north, 16 years old, and already the most dangerous military commander on the continent. The boy whose tactical instincts had destroyed Jaime Lannister at the Whispering Wood, and routed the Lannister forces at Oxcross, and turned a defensive war into an offensive one through the combination of audacity and intelligence that the songs were already calling genius. Robb did not care about the songs. Robb cared about the war. A Targaryen girl. The room changed. The change was not physical. The stone walls and the oak table and the war maps remained where they were. The change was atmospheric. The word Targaryen, in a room full of northern lords, produced a reaction that was part memory and part reflex, and part the bone-deep northern response to a name that the north associated with fire and madness, and the war that had killed Rickard and Brandon Stark. Targaryen, the Great John said. The massive lord whose voice filled rooms as his body filled doorways. Completely. With no space left for alternatives. The Mad King's blood. The Mad King's granddaughter. Aerys's son Rhaegar's, the Blackfish, caught himself. The correction that would have been accurate, that the girl was Aerys's daughter, not granddaughter, was also the correction that mattered. Aerys's daughter. The last surviving Targaryen. Daenerys. A Targaryen girl is not a war council matter, Lord Karstark said. Rickard Karstark, the lord whose hatred of Lannisters was personal, and whose hatred of Targaryens was ancestral, and whose combination of hatreds left limited space for what the Blackfish was proposing. A Targaryen girl across the narrow sea is less than nothing. The Targaryens are done. The Targaryens have 3 dragons. The room changed again. The second change was larger than the first. The word Targaryen produced memory. The word dragons produced silence. The Grietjon broke it. Dragons. 3. hatched from eggs during a funeral pyre in the Dothraki Sea. The girl walked into fire and walked out with 3 living dragons. The reports come from traders in Karth, from ship captains in Pentos, from slavers in Astapor. The sources are independent. The sources agree. 3 dragons. Small, still growing, but 3. Growing, Robb said. The word that mattered. Not the 3. 3 was a number. Not the dragons. Dragons were legend. Growing was what made legend into strategy. Growing meant the dragons would be larger tomorrow than today. Growing meant the weapon was increasing. Growing meant time was a factor. How large? The Blackfish asked. Asking his own question. The veteran's habit of interrogating his own intelligence to test its edges. The largest is the size of a large dog, black and red. The traders call it the Shadow Wing. The girl calls it Drogon, after her dead husband, a Dothraki Carl. The other 2 are smaller, green and bronze, cream and gold. Dog-sized dragons are not weapons, Stark said. Dog-sized dragons that are growing are weapons that haven't finished growing. A year from now, 2 years, those dragons will be the size of horses. 5 years and they'll be the size of the hall we're standing in. That's not legend, that's mathematics. Catelyn Stark listened. The Lady of Winterfell. The mother whose political mind operated on a different axis than the military minds around the table. The military minds saw the war. Catelyn saw the war and the peace and what connected them. The marriage that would make the peace possible. The marriage that the military minds had not considered because military minds thought in terms of battles and Catelyn thought in terms of alliances. Catelyn thought in terms of alliances because Catelyn was a Tully. And the Tullys, the family that had governed the Riverlands for 300 years through the management of relationships rather than the application of force. The Tullys understood what the Starks and the Umbers and the Karstarks did not instinctively grasp, that wars were won on battlefields, but kingdoms were built in marriage beds. The girl, Catelyn said. She has an army? The Blackfish turned to his niece. The assessment, the veteran recognizing that the question was not about armies, but about something larger. 8,000 unsullied, bought, liberated from the slavers of Astapor. She sacked the city, freed the slaves, and marched on Yunkai. She's taken Meereen. She sits on a throne in the Great Pyramid and rules a city of former slaves with 3 dragons and 8,000 of the finest infantry in the known world. She's a conqueror, Robb said. She's a Targaryen. Conquering is the family trade. We overthrew the family trade. My father, my grandfather, they bled to end the Targaryen dynasty. And now you're suggesting, I'm suggesting that 3 dragons don't care about your grandfather's war. Dragons are not political. Dragons are fire and teeth and the ability to burn a castle from the air. And the Lannisters don't have them. And we don't have them. And a girl in Meereen does. The Blackfish let the statement stand. The statement stood because the statement was correct. The war, Robb's war, the war for northern independence and Riverlands survival and Lannister destruction, the war had reached the stage where military victories alone could not produce the outcome the victories required. Robb had won every battle. Robb had not won the war. The Lannisters held King's Landing. The Lannisters held the wealth of the Westerlands. The Lannisters held the alliance with the Tyrells, the alliance that put the largest army in Westeros at Tywin Lannister's disposal, and that Robb's battlefield brilliance could not overcome through tactics alone. The mathematics were the mathematics. The North and the Riverlands against the Westerlands and the Reach and the Crownlands. The numbers did not favor the wolf. The numbers favored the lion. And the numbers would continue to favor the lion until something changed the numbers. 3 dragons changed the numbers. You're proposing an alliance, Catelyn said. Not a question. The Tully mind, reading the implication before the implication was stated, processing the politics as the Blackfish processed military intelligence, arriving at the destination before the speaker had finished describing the road. I'm proposing a marriage. The third change in the room was the largest. The word marriage in the context of a Targaryen girl produced the reaction that marriage always produced in war councils. The reaction that was part calculation and part instinct, and part the ancient understanding that marriage was not romance, but strategy. Not love, but leverage. Not a personal matter, but a political one. A marriage, the Great John roared. The volume was the Great John's natural setting, the setting that the Great John applied to every word regardless of context. To a Targaryen, the king in the north, the first king in the north in 300 years, married to the blood of the dynasty that conquered the north? The blood of the dynasty that has 3 dragons. The distinction matters. The distinction is that Torrance Stark knelt to dragons, and we swore that no Stark would kneel again. The crown on Robb's head is the crown that says, the kneeling is over, and you want him to marry into the family he's kneeling away from. I don't want him to kneel. I want him to marry. Marriage is not kneeling. Marriage is. Marriage to a Targaryen is kneeling. The Targaryens don't share thrones. They sit on them. And the person they marry sits beside them, below them. The dragon doesn't share the sky. The Great John's assessment was not wrong. The assessment was the northern assessment, the assessment that understood Targaryen history and that processed Targaryen history through the northern lens that said, we bent once, we will not bend again. The assessment was emotional and historical and, in its own way, accurate, but the assessment was also incomplete. The dragon doesn't share the sky, the Blackfish said. But the dragon hasn't crossed the sky yet. The girl is in Meereen. She needs Westeros. She needs allies who know Westeros, who hold territory in Westeros, who command armies in Westeros. She needs what we have. And we need what she has. We need nothing from Targaryens. We need 3 dragons, John. We need 3 dragons. Because Tywin Lannister has 80,000 men and the wealth of Casterly Rock and an alliance with the Reach that gives him another 100,000. We have 40,000, brave, northern, and outnumbered. 3 dragons change the arithmetic. 3 dragons turn 80,000 men into 80,000 targets. Bolton observed. Roose Bolton, the Lord of the Dreadfort, the pale-eyed lord, whose presence in war councils was the presence of a man who watched everything and contributed the minimum that watching required. Bolton did not argue. Bolton did not advocate. Bolton processed. The processing was what made Bolton dangerous. Not the advocacy, but the calculation. The quiet assessment of every proposal against the measure that Bolton applied to every proposal. Does this benefit Roose Bolton? The measure was simple. The application was what made the Dreadfort Lord the most dangerous man in the room who was not holding a crown. Bolton processed the Blackfish's proposal. The processing produced a result. The result was, dragons changed the calculation. In the world without dragons, the world that Bolton had been calculating in for months, the northern cause was strong but fragile. The fragility was the opportunity. The opportunity was the Lannister offer, the offer that Tywin had not made, but that Bolton knew Tywin would make. The offer that said, deliver the North, and the North is yours. Bolton had not accepted the offer that did not exist. Bolton had filed it. Bolton had filed it. Preparation for the day when the calculation tipped, when the northern cause weakened enough that betrayal became more profitable than loyalty. Dragons changed the tipping point. Dragons did not eliminate the calculation. Nothing eliminated Bolton's calculations. But dragons moved the point at which betrayal became profitable so far into the future that the filing became less relevant and the loyalty became more immediately useful. Bolton would remain loyal. For now, and for longer than before. The proposal has merit, Bolton said, the voice that was always too soft for the words it carried, the voice that forced listeners to lean forward, that made the listening an act of submission. The alliance would strengthen our position. The question is whether the girl would accept. The girl conquered 3 cities and commands an army of eunuch soldiers, the Blackfish said. The girl has more military experience than half this council. Don't call her the girl. The Queen then, would the Queen accept? The Queen wants Westeros. We're offering her Westeros. Or the path to it. We're offering her the North. The North is not Westeros. The North is one kingdom of 7. She wants 7. She wants 7. She'll start with 1, and the one that comes with a ready-made army and a king willing to ally is worth more than the 6 that come with resistance. Robb listened. The king in the North, the boy king whose crown sat on auburn hair and whose eyes held the calculation that was not Bolton's calculation, but the Stark calculation. The calculation that weighed honor against necessity, and that found, in the weighing, what his father would have missed, the space between honor and pragmatism where a king could stand without abandoning either. Robb heard the Blackfish's military argument. Robb heard the Greatjohn's emotional objection. Robb heard Bolton's careful endorsement and identified, in the endorsement, the self-interest that Bolton would never admit. Robb heard Karstark's hatred and the Blackfish's realism and his mother's silence. The silence that was Catelyn's most articulate statement. The silence that said, I am waiting. Because what I want to say requires the room to be ready to hear it. Mother, Catelyn looked at her son. The king in the North who was also her boy, the firstborn. The heir, the child she had raised in Winterfell, and who had grown into something larger than Winterfell in the months since the war began. The boy who asked for his mother's counsel in a room full of lords who would have dismissed a woman's counsel was the boy who understood what the lords did not, that counsel's value was not determined by the counselor's gender, but by the counselor's mind. And Catelyn's mind was the sharpest in the room. There is a precedent, Catelyn said. Torrhen Stark marched south with 30,000 men to fight Aegon the Conqueror. He saw the field of fire, saw what dragons had done to the combined armies of the Reach and the Westerlands. He saw the destruction, and Torrhen Stark, the king who knelt, made the decision that saved those 30,000 lives. He bent the knee. Not from cowardice, from calculation. From the understanding that fighting dragons was dying, and that dying was not governing, and that governing was the responsibility that the crown demanded. The crown demands that I not kneel. The crown demands that you win. Kneeling and losing are both failures. The question is which failure you can survive. I don't intend to fail. Then consider the mathematics. Tywin Lannister's mathematics. The Tyrell Alliance. The Redwyne Fleet. The gold of Casterly Rock. Consider those mathematics, and then consider 3 dragons and 8,000 unsullied, and the name Targaryen. The name that half the lords in the 7 kingdoms remember as the name of their rightful rulers. Consider that mathematics, and tell me the answer. Robb held the mathematics. The king's calculation, not his mother's calculation, or the Blackfish's calculation, or Bolton's calculation, but the king's calculation. The calculation that combined all 3 and added the 4th dimension that only the king could add. The weight of the crown itself. The weight that said, the decision is mine. The consequences are mine. The kingdom that rises or falls on this decision is the kingdom I built, and that I carry, and that I will answer for. The phrase, Robb said. The word dropped into the room like a stone into water. I am pledged to marry a Frey. The price of the crossing. The twins. Walder Frey's bridge. The bridge we needed to cross the Green Fork and relieve Riverlands. The price was a marriage. My marriage. To one of Walder Frey's daughters. The pledge, the Blackfish said. The veteran's assessment of the obstacle. Not moral but practical. Not about honor but about consequence. The pledge to the phrase is a problem. The pledge to the phrase is an oath. The pledge to the phrase is an oath made to a man whose loyalty is transactional, whose house has never honored an oath that became inconvenient, and whose bridge is less valuable than 3 dragons. The phrase will be angry. The phrase are always angry. The question is whether angry phrase are more dangerous than no dragons. Breaking an oath is something you've never done, and something Walder Frey has done 17 times by my count. The old weasel changes sides like other men change clothes. He waited out Robert's rebellion until the battle was decided. He delayed his march to the Trident until Rhaegar was dead. He has broken faith with every Lord Paramount who has ever relied on his crossing. You owe him a daughter's hand. He owes the world a lifetime of bad faith. Catelyn spoke. Breaking the oath is dangerous, Catelyn said. Not because Walder Frey is honorable. Walder Frey has never been honorable. But because Walder Frey is vindictive. The slight matters more than the oath. The old man counts his insults like other men count their gold. Breaking the marriage pledge will create an enemy, a petty enemy, a small enemy, but an enemy with a strategic position. The twins control the crossing. The crossing controls movement between the north and the Riverlands. A hostile fray at the twins is a knife at the throat of our supply lines. Then we manage the frays, the Blackfish said. We offer compensation. Gold, land, a different marriage, not the king's but a lord's. The frays want elevation. Give them elevation without giving them the throne. Walder Frey was promised a queen. Walder Frey will accept nothing less. Walder Frey was promised a Stark. Offer him a Stark. Offer him, the Blackfish paused. The calculation, the military mind encountering the personal dimension that military minds preferred to avoid. Offer him a different Stark. The room went still. No, Catelyn said. The word that was a wall. Cat, you will not offer my children. Robb's marriage is a strategic matter. Arya is 11. Sansa is a hostage in King's Landing. Bran cannot walk. Rickon is 6. You will not trade my children for a bridge. The Blackfish retreated. Not from weakness, from the recognition that the wall was permanent, and that the wall was his niece, and that the wall could not be moved by argument, because the wall was a mother, and mothers did not negotiate with the safety of their children. Then we managed the phrase without a Stark marriage, the Blackfish said. Edmure marries a Frey. Catelyn turned to the Blackfish, the Tully assessment shifting from rejection to evaluation. Edmure? The Lord of Riverroon marrying a Frey is a significant honor. Not a king's honor, but a Lord Paramount's honor. The Freys would gain entry to one of the great houses. Walder Frey has wanted that for 60 years. Give him Edmure, and he'll swallow the loss of the king. Walder Frey will not swallow anything. Walder Frey will chew on the insult for years. Walder Frey can chew on whatever he likes. The point is whether he acts on the chewing. And if Edmure is married to his daughter, and the Starks have 3 dragons, the chewing remains chewing. The acting becomes suicide. Robb made the decision. The decision was what kings did, what councils debated and advisers argued, and lords advocated, but that only the king performed. The decision. The moment where all the calculations and arguments and political assessments compressed into a single point, and the king stepped onto that point and declared, "This. Send an envoy," Robb said, "to Meereen, to Daenerys Targaryen, with an offer of alliance and marriage." The Great John's objection was immediate and loud and exactly what the room expected. "Your Grace, the offer is conditional. John, the marriage proceeds if the terms are acceptable. The terms include northern independence. The North bends the knee to no one, not the Iron Throne, not the dragon, not the girl who sits on it. If she accepts a marriage that preserves the North's crown alongside hers, then the alliance is worth more than every Frey bridge in Westeros. And if she refuses, then she refuses, and we fight the war without dragons. We've been fighting without dragons. We can continue. We can continue losing. We haven't lost yet. We haven't won." Either Robb held the truth of that, the king's truth. The truth that the king carried, and that the lords contributed to, but that only the king bore the full weight of. The war was not lost. The war was not won. The war sat between those 2 states, and that would resolve into one or the other based on the decisions the king made in rooms like this one. "Send the envoy," Robb said, "and pray that the Dragon Queen is as smart as the traders say she is." The envoy. What the North sent across the water. The envoy was Mage Mormont. The choice was the Blackfish's, the veterans' assessment of who could cross a sea, find a queen, and negotiate an alliance without either offending the queen or surrendering the North's position. The choice required a rare combination: northern enough to represent the North's interests, pragmatic enough to negotiate with a Targaryen, tough enough to survive the crossing, and important enough to demonstrate that the offer was serious. Mage Mormont was all four. The Lady of Bear Island, the warrior lady whose house occupied the island off the northwestern coast that was the North's most remote and most fiercely independent holding. The Mormonts were the North's edge, the families that lived where the North met the sea and that defended what the sea produced. Bear Island produced fighters. Bear Island produced women who fought alongside their men. Bear Island produced Mage Mormont. And Bear Island had produced Jorah Mormont. The connection was what the Blackfish did not mention, and that Catelyn identified, and that Robb, when the connection landed, recognized as the strategic asset it was. Jorah Mormont, Mage's nephew, the former Lord of Bear Island, the exile who had fled Westeros after selling poachers into slavery, and who had, according to the intelligence that crossed the narrow sea in traders' mouths and captains' logs, become Daenerys Targaryen's most trusted advisor. Jorah is with her, the Blackfish confirmed. Has been since before the dragons. He came to her through Illyrio Mopatis in Pentos, sent as a spy for the Iron Throne, selling reports to Varys in exchange for a royal pardon. Somewhere between the spying and the dragons, the loyalty became real. He's her military advisor, her confidant, the man she trusts, and the man who once betrayed her, though she does not know it yet. Jorah is a slaver and a traitor, Catelyn said. Jorah is a fool who loved a woman too expensive for Bear Island. He sold poachers to fund his wife's tastes. He ran when Ned came for his head. He's been running ever since. Running east, running to the Targaryens, running to this girl. But Jorah is also a Mormont, and Mage is a Mormont. And blood does not erase the exile. Blood does not erase the exile. But blood opens the door. Mage arrives in Meereen and finds her nephew, the nephew she hasn't seen in years, the nephew whose name is Shame on Bear Island, the nephew who nonetheless has the ear of the Queen. The nephew opens the door. Mage walks through it. Mage Mormont accepted the assignment as Mage Mormont accepted everything, with a blunt nod and a practical question. How many ships? 1. A trading galley out of Seaguard. You'll travel as a merchant, furs and amber, northern goods for the eastern markets. The cover holds until Meereen. When you arrive, you drop the cover and present yourself as the envoy of the king in the north. And if the queen refuses the audience, find Jorah. Jorah won't refuse his aunt, even if the exile has shame enough to fill a ship, and Jorah's shame could fill a fleet. The Mormont blood opens the first door. What you do with the open door is the negotiation. I'll open the door. I'll walk through it. And if the dragon girl says no, I'll ask her again. And if she says no a second time, I'll tell her she's making a mistake and ask a third time. That's the Mormont approach. The Mormont approach works. Magi sailed from Seaguard on a morning that smelled of salt and river mud. The trading galley, a broad-beamed vessel called the Maiden's Courage, the galley cleared the harbour and turned south and east, following the coast toward the Stepstones and the route that would carry it across the narrow sea to Slaver's Bay. The crossing took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of salt water and wind, and the endless horizon that separated the world Magi knew from the world Magi was entering. 6 weeks of the trading galley pushing through autumn swells, past the Stepstones, through the straits into the summer sea, and east past Luz and Volantis and the coast of Essos, east toward the place where the map changed from familiar to foreign, and the foreign became the destination. Mage used the 6 weeks. The using was preparation, the warrior lady's approach to negotiation, which was the warrior lady's approach to combat. Learn the terrain, assess the enemy, identify the leverage, plan the approach. Mage read what the ship's captain could tell her about Meereen. Mage interrogated the traders who had been to Slaver's Bay. Mage assembled the picture of Daenerys Targaryen that the fragments produced, the picture that was incomplete and contradictory, and that Mage knew she would have to replace with the reality when she arrived. The fragments produced a woman, young, not yet 20, silver-haired, violet-eyed, Targaryen to the bone, married at 13 to a Dothraki Carl, the horse lord who had died of a wound and whose death had produced the funeral pyre, and the funeral pyre had produced the dragons. Survived the Red Waste, a desert crossing that had killed half her people. Arrived in Karth, a city of merchants and warlocks where she had been betrayed and threatened, and where she had burned the House of the Undying and taken what she needed and left. Conquered Astapor. Freed slaves. Took the Unsullied, the slave soldiers who were the finest infantry in the world, and made them her army by freeing them and asking them to choose, and the choosing had been unanimous. Marched on Yunkai. Took Meereen. The picture was a conqueror. The picture was also a liberator. The combination was what made Daenerys Targaryen different from the Targaryens that the North remembered, the Targaryens who had conquered for dynasty and ruled for power. This Targaryen conquered for freedom. The distinction mattered. Whether the distinction would survive the transition from Essos to Westeros, from liberating slaves to claiming thrones, was the question that Maege would carry into the negotiation. Meereen appeared on the 39th day. The city rose from the coast like a monument to the civilization that had built it. The pyramid and the harbour and the walls that the Giscari had raised and that Daenerys Targaryen had breached, and that now flew the three-headed dragon banner that Maege could see from the ship's deck, the banner that was red and black and that said, "To anyone who could read the language of banners, the Targaryens are here." The harbour was busy. Ships from Volantis, from Karth, from Pentos and Myr and Tyrosh, the merchant fleet that served any ruler who controlled a major trading city, the ships that did not care about politics but cared about profit and that went where profit directed. Maege's trading galley joined the traffic and docked at the long stone quay that the great masters had built and that the freedmen now managed. Maege stepped onto the dock. The heat was the first thing. The dry, pressing heat that was nothing like the wet cold of Bear Island, and that told Maege, in the language that climate spoke, that she was very far from home. The second thing was the smell. Spice and dung, and the salt of a different sea. The smell of a city that had been a slave market for centuries, and that was now something else. Something that had not existed before, and that did not have a name, because the naming required time, and the time was still accumulating. The third thing was the dragon. It flew over the harbour on the afternoon of Maege's arrival. The black one, Drogon, the trader's shadow wing, the dragon that was larger than the reports had suggested, larger than a dog, larger than a horse. A winged shape against the blue Murena's sky that cast a shadow on the water and that produced in Maege Mormont what dragons had always produced in those who saw them for the first time. Fear and awe. And the combination that the Valyrians had called dragonfire, and that was not fire, but the recognition, instantaneous, physical, undeniable, that the world contained something larger than the largest thing you had imagined, and that the something was alive, and that the something answered to a girl. 7 hells, Maege said. On the dock, looking up at the shadow that crossed the sun. The Bear Island lady whose vocabulary was as practical as her sword arm, whose response to the extraordinary was the same as her response to the ordinary, acknowledgement followed by adaptation. The dragon was real. The dragons were real. And if the dragons were real, then the alliance was not a theoretical exercise, but a practical opportunity. And practical opportunities were what Maege Mormont had crossed a sea to negotiate. Maege found Jorah on the second day. Not through effort, through inevitability. Meereen's court was not large enough, and the Mormont name was not common enough for a Bear Island lady to arrive in the city without the Bear Island exile hearing about it. Jorah found Maege as information found its destination in a city under siege, through the network of freedmen and Unsullied and advisors who monitored the harbour and reported arrivals, and who had reported, with the precision that Daenerys' intelligence operation demanded, that a woman from Westeros had arrived on a trading galley. A woman who wore armour like a soldier and carried herself like a lord, and whose name was Mormont. The name was what brought Jorah to the harbour side inn, where Maege had taken a room. Aunt Maege. The voice came from the doorway. The man who stood in the doorway was not the man Maege remembered, The man Mage remembered was a young lord. Proud, reckless, a man whose appetites had exceeded his island's ability to feed them. The man in the doorway was older, harder. The sun had darkened the skin, and the exile had hardened the expression, and the years between Bear Island and Meereen had turned the young lord into something that the young lord would not have recognized. A man who had been stripped of everything, and who had built a new identity from the wreckage, and who wore the new identity with the discomfort of a man wearing armor that fit but did not belong to him. Jorah. The word. The name. The sound that crossed the distance between the woman who had inherited Bear Island because the man who should have held it had run, and the man who had run, and who was now standing in a doorway in Meereen, hearing the name spoken in the voice that was his family's voice. The voice that carried Bear Island in its vowels, and the North in its consonants, and the judgment. The Mormont judgment, blunt and unforgiving and fair in the tone. "You look well," Jorah said. "You look exiled." The bluntness was the Mormont way. The Mormonts did not soften. The Mormonts did not cushion. The Mormonts stated, and the stating was the communication, and the communication was complete when the statement had been made and received. Jorah received it. "I am exiled. You're standing in front of your aunt in a city 10,000 miles from the island your father died defending. Exiled is a gentle word for the thing you are. My father, the flinch. The wound that the word father opened in the man who had shamed the father, Jorah Mormont, the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. The old bear who had given up Bear Island when Jorah fled, and who had taken the black, and who had died beyond the wall. My father is dead beyond the wall, killed by his own men at Craster's Keep." Jorah held the word. Dead, the word that the exile had dreaded, the word that meant the shame could never be answered, the forgiveness could never be asked for, the conversation between father and son that would have cost everything and resolved everything would never happen, because the father was dead, and death was a border that conversations could not cross. When? Months ago. The ravens carried the word south. Jorah's hand found the door frame, the steadying, the physical reaction to the emotional impact that the man would not otherwise display. The Mormont control that held the grief inside the body and expressed it only through the hand that gripped the wood and the jaw that tightened and the eyes that closed for 3 seconds and opened again carrying the weight of a thing that would not diminish. "Sit," Magi said. "I didn't cross the narrow sea to deliver bad news. The bad news is free. The rest costs a conversation." "What rest?" "The rest is why I'm here. And the rest is the reason I need to see your queen." Jorah sat. The exile sitting in the room where the family had found him, the family he had abandoned and that had crossed an ocean to reach him. Not for reconciliation, but for strategy. And that was how the conversation that would change the war began. "The king in the north," Magi said, "Robb Stark, son of Eddard, sends his regards, though regards is my word, not his. His word is alliance. He wants an alliance with Daenerys Targaryen. An alliance. A marriage." Jorah held the word marriage like a swordsman held a blade, by the handle, with respect for the edge. Marriage. The word that connected 2 people and 2 causes and 2 futures. The word that, in the context of Robb Stark and Daenerys Targaryen, connected the North and the throne and the question of whether the 2 could share a kingdom. She won't bend to a northern king. He won't bend to a Targaryen queen. Then, the marriage is. The marriage is the thing I'm here to negotiate. The bending is the problem. The marriage is the solution. Or the attempt at one. You don't know her, Aunt Mage. She doesn't compromise. Not on the throne. Not on the kingdoms. She believes, she knows, that the Iron Throne is hers by right. 7 kingdoms. Not 6. Not 1. 7. She can believe in 7. Robb holds 1. The one she doesn't hold is the one she needs, because the one she doesn't hold has 40,000 soldiers and a king who's beaten every army the Lannisters have sent against him. She wants Westeros? Westeros starts with the North, and the North starts with Robb Stark. And what does Robb Stark want? Robb Stark wants dragons. Robb Stark wants the war won. Robb Stark wants his sisters back, and the Lannisters destroyed, and the North free. And Robb Stark is willing to marry a Targaryen to get those things. Willing. Willing is the word a king uses when he's made a decision he doesn't enjoy. Willing means, I've weighed the cost. Willing means, the cost is worth it. Take me to your queen. Jorah took Mae to the queen. Not immediately. The court of Meereen did not operate on Bear Island time, and Bear Island time was the time that said, now is better than later. Later is the enemy of done. Done is the goal. The court of Meereen operated on the time of a queen who received petitioners in order, and who did not elevate a northern envoy above the freedmen and merchants and former slaves who waited their turns in the Great Pyramid's audience hall. Maege waited. The waiting tested Maege Mormont's patience, a quality that Bear Island had developed in some of its children, and that Maege had received in smaller quantity than most. Maege waited because Jorah explained that waiting was the protocol, and because Maege, despite her impatience, grasped what protocol communicated, we are the power here. You are the supplicant. The arrangement of time reflects the arrangement of authority. Maege waited. And on the third day, Maege Mormont, Lady of Bear Island, envoy of Robb Stark, king in the north, walked into the Great Pyramid of Meereen and met the woman who would change the war. Meereen, what the Dragon Queen saw in the wolf's offer. Daenerys Targaryen sat on the bench she had placed where the Master's throne had been. Not a throne. Daenerys would not sit on the Master's throne, because the Master's throne was built from the suffering of slaves, and Daenerys had broken the suffering and would not rest in its architecture. The bench was Daenerys' choice, the choice that said, I rule here. But I do not rule as the Masters ruled. The distinction mattered. Whether the distinction survived the transition from liberator to queen, from breaking chains to wearing crowns, was a question that Meereen had not answered and that Westeros would test. The audience hall of the Great Pyramid was enormous. The space, the vertical emptiness that the Giscari had carved from stone and that rose above the bench like a cathedral to the power that the Giscari had worshipped and that Daenerys had repurposed. The space dwarfed the woman who sat in it. Daenerys was small, silver-haired, violet-eyed, young enough that the word girl was not inaccurate, and old enough that the word woman was not premature. She sat on the bench with the posture of a queen, and the expression of a ruler, and the eyes of a person who had walked through fire and emerged holding three impossible things. Maege Mormont was announced. The announcement, spoken by Missandei, the former slave from Narth whose voice carried the titles and the formalities that the court required and that Maege did not care about. The announcement introduced the Lady of Bear Island, envoy of His Grace Robb Stark, King in the North and King of the Trident, Lord of Winterfell. Daenerys heard the titles. The titles produced a reaction that Daenerys did not display. King, the word that another man, a boy, a wolf, a Stark, was using to describe himself. King in the North. The title that said, I have taken a piece of your inheritance and named it mine. King of the Trident. The title that said, I have taken a second piece. The titles were declarations. The declarations were, the 7 kingdoms are no longer 7. The North and the Riverlands have departed. The departure is the loss that Daenerys would have to recover or accept. Daenerys did not display the reaction, because Daenerys had learned, through Drogo's death and the Red Waste and Karth and the Warlocks and the Slavers, that the display of reaction was the surrender of advantage. Reaction told others what you felt. What you felt told others how to move you. How to move you was how to control you. And Daenerys Targaryen, the woman who had been sold and traded and underestimated and betrayed and who had survived all of it through the combination of fire and will that was her inheritance, Daenerys Targaryen was not controlled. Lady Mormont, Daenerys said. Bear Island, Your Grace. Maege bowed. The bow was northern, a bend of the body that acknowledged rank without surrendering dignity. The bow that the North had perfected over centuries of dealing with kings and queens and Targaryens and that communicated, I respect your position. Do not mistake the respect for submission. You come from the man who calls himself king in the north, from the man who is king in the north, crowned by his lords after his father was murdered by the Lannisters, chosen, not born to the crown, not appointed by a council, but chosen by the men who fight for him. The crown was placed on his head by the great Jon Umber and accepted by every lord from last hearth to the neck. The crown he wears was the crown his ancestor Torrhen Stark surrendered to mine, to Aegon the Conqueror. 300 years ago. 300 years ago, your ancestor had 3 dragons. Today, you have 3 dragons. The parallel is that the last king in the north who faced dragons knelt. The parallel is that the last king in the north who faced dragons was wise enough to choose survival over pride. And the Targaryen who received that kneeling was wise enough to reward the kneeling with dignity. Daenerys held this. The assessment, the Northern Lady's reframing of the Torrhen precedent from submission to strategy, from kneeling to choosing. The reframing was skilled. The reframing was also accurate. Your king sends you with a proposal. My king sends me with an alliance. Marriage, Robb Stark, king in the north, offers his hand and his sword and his kingdom to Daenerys Targaryen, queen of Meereen, mother of dragons. In exchange for her hand, her dragons, and the war that they can win together. Win against whom? Against the Lannisters, against Tywin Lannister and Cersei Lannister, and the boy they've put on the Iron Throne. The boy called Joffrey, who is not Robert Baratheon's son, but Jaime Lannister's bastard. The product of incest between the queen and her brother. The throne you want is held by a pretender. The armies defending that pretender are the armies my king has been fighting and defeating for a year. Together, the wolf and the dragon, those armies fall. The pretender falls. The throne is yours. The throne is already mine, by right and by blood, and by 300 years of Targaryen rule. Yes, but right is not possession. Right is not armies. Right is not the ability to cross the narrow sea and take what right says is yours. Right without force is a word. And words don't conquer kingdoms. Armies do. Dragons do. And the army, and the dragons, and the right combined with a northern alliance, that conquers kingdoms. Barristan Selmy stood beside the queen, the old knight, Sir Barristan the Bold, the legendary swordsman who had served the Kingsguard under 3 kings, and who had been dismissed by Joffrey, and who had crossed the world to find the Targaryen heir and pledge his sword. Barristan listened to the Mormont envoy and heard what Barristan's decades of service had trained him to hear, the truth beneath the negotiation. Your Grace, Barristan said. The proposal has historical precedent, the precedent being Torrhen's submission, the precedent being the alliance that followed. After Torrhen knelt, the Starks governed the north for 300 years as wardens, not as subjects in the southern sense, but as partners in the Targaryen peace. The north kept its customs. The north kept its gods. The north kept its laws. The price was the crown. Everything else remained. Everything except sovereignty. Sovereignty is a word that means different things in different kingdoms. In the north, sovereignty meant the Stark in Winterfell ruled the north, and the dragon on the Iron Throne ruled everything else, and the border between the rulings was respected. The arrangement worked for 3 centuries. The arrangement ended with my father's madness. The arrangement ended when your father burned the Lord of Winterfell alive. The arrangement ended when the Targaryens broke the trust that the arrangement required. The breaking was ours, the Targaryen failure, not the Stark betrayal. The rebellion was the response. The response was earned. Daenerys looked at Barristan, the look that held the history and the judgment and the acceptance that Daenerys had practiced since learning the truth about her father, the truth that said Aerys was mad. Aerys burned men alive. Aerys destroyed the dynasty. The acceptance was not denial. Daenerys did not deny her father's madness. The acceptance was, I am not my father. The dynasty's failure does not determine the dynasty's future. I determine the future. What does the king in the north propose? Precisely, Daenerys asked, turning back to Mage. The word precisely, the Queen's word, the word that demanded the terms beneath the rhetoric. Marriage. Your hand and his. The union of Stark and Targaryen, which, if I remember the histories, is a union that Robb's aunt Lyanna and your brother Rhaegar attempted, and that the world prevented. The world was wrong to prevent it. The preventing produced a war. The marriage produces a peace. The invocation of Rhaegar and Lyanna was deliberate. Mage had planned it. The Mormont pragmatism applied to negotiation, the understanding that history was not decoration, but leverage. Rhaegar and Lyanna, the prince and the she-wolf whose love had started Robert's rebellion and ended the Targaryen dynasty. The invocation said, "This marriage corrects the mistake. This marriage completes the story that your brother started." Daenerys heard the invocation. The hearing produced the response that Magi had intended, not agreement, but interest. The shift from evaluation to engagement that marked the transition from dismissal to consideration. The terms: alliance against the Lannisters, combined forces, northern armies and your unsullied, your dragons, whatever other forces you command. The war prosecuted jointly. King's Landing taken. The Pretender removed. Daenerys Targaryen on the Iron Throne. And the North? The question was the question. The question that Mage had carried across the narrow sea, and that Robb had wrestled with in Riverlands, and that the Grietjon had roared about, and that Bolton had calculated, and that Catelyn had assessed. The question that was the heart of the negotiation, and that had no easy answer. The North remains the North. Robb Stark remains king in the North. The marriage unites the crowns through blood. The children of Robb Stark and Daenerys Targaryen inherit both. The North and the Iron Throne, joined not by kneeling, but by marriage, by blood, by the children who carry both names. So the North bows to no one. The North bows to the children. The children are half Stark and half Targaryen. The inheritance resolves the division, not in this generation, but in the next. Robb rules the North. Daenerys rules the rest. The children rule everything. Daenerys considered. The consideration was the Queen's work, the work that no advisor could perform, that no council could decide. That sat on the shoulders of the woman who wore the crown. The consideration weighed the offer against the alternatives. The alternatives were: continue in Meereen, build power, cross the narrow sea alone, with the Unsullied and the dragons and no Westerosi allies, land on hostile shores, fight every lord between Dragonstone and King's Landing, take the throne through conquest alone, as Aegon had done, as the Targaryens had always done, with fire and blood and the dragons that made fire and blood possible. The alternative was possible. Aegon had done it. But Aegon had done it with 3 full-grown dragons, dragons large enough to melt stone and burn armies. Daenerys' dragons were growing fast. But growing was not grown, and the alternative, the solo conquest, required time that the growing demanded, and that the political situation in Westeros might not provide. The offer provided something the alternative did not: an existing army, an existing alliance, an existing position in Westeros. The North was a foothold. A foothold was the beginning. The beginning was what the solo conquest had to create from nothing, and that the Stark alliance handed to Daenerys ready-made. "I will consider the proposal," Daenerys said. "You will have my answer." "When?" "When I've decided." Mage accepted this, the acceptance, the Mormont pragmatism recognizing that queens decided on queens' timelines, and that pushing the timeline was pushing the queen, and that pushing the queen was pushing the negotiation toward failure. Mage waited. Daenerys consulted. The consultation was what queens did between the hearing and the deciding, the gathering of perspectives, the weighing of voices. The process that looked like indecision, but was the opposite of indecision. The process was decision-making in its fullest form, the form that incorporated every relevant viewpoint before committing to the viewpoint that would become policy. Barristan spoke first. in the Queen's private chambers. The small council. The council that was not the Iron Throne's small council, but the council that served the same function. The inner circle of advisors who spoke to the Queen without the audience, and without the performance, and with the honesty that the audience hall's formality sometimes prevented. The marriage has value, Barristan said. The Starks are the most respected house in Westeros, the house whose honor is the house's currency. Marrying a Stark says to every lord in the Seven Kingdoms, the Targaryens have returned, and the Targaryens have returned allied with the North. The Lannisters cannot match that alliance. The Tyrells cannot match it. The combination of Targaryen right and Stark honor is the combination that wins not armies, but loyalty. Loyalty that costs me the North. Loyalty that costs you the North in this generation and regains it in the next. The children, the Mormont lady's argument about the children, the argument is sound. The children of Robb Stark and Daenerys Targaryen are the bridge. The bridge resolves the division. The bridge is a generation away. I need the throne now. You need allies now. The throne comes after the allies. Jorah spoke second. The exile, the man whose counsel Daenerys had trusted for years, and whose counsel was now complicated by the arrival of the woman who represented everything Jorah had lost, Bear Island, the North. The home that the exile had forfeited. The North is not a gift, Jorah said. The North is a loan. Robb Stark offers the North's armies and Robb Stark's sword. In exchange, he keeps his crown. The exchange is, you gain an ally, you lose a kingdom. 7 kingdoms minus 1. 6 kingdoms and an ally is more than 7 kingdoms and no army to take them. 6 kingdoms and an ally who may decide, once the Lannisters are defeated, that the alliance has served its purpose. Allies are not subjects. Allies leave. And subjects rebel. My father's subjects rebelled. The loyalty of subjects ended the dynasty. Perhaps the loyalty of an ally, a freely chosen ally, a man who marries me not from conquest but from choice. Perhaps that loyalty lasts longer. Jorah held the response. The response was what the exile could not articulate. Something personal and political and tangled in the years of service and the feeling that Jorah carried, and that the conversation about Robb Stark, a young king, a young man, the man who would share Daenerys' bed, the conversation pressed against the feeling with the cruelty that conversations about other men's marriages applied to men who loved where they could not have. The Starks are honorable, Jorah said. The word that cost him, the word that acknowledged the quality that the Starks possessed and that Jorah, through his own choices, had surrendered. Ned Stark was the most honorable man I ever met. Honorable enough to sentence me to death for the thing I did. Honorable enough to be right about the sentencing. If Robb Stark is his father's son, and the reports say he is, then the honor is real. The alliance, if built on that honor, will hold. But the North is proud. The North remembers. The North remembers Torrhen's kneeling the way the North remembers everything, as a wound. Asking the North to kneel again, even through marriage, even through children, even through the promise of a future where the kneeling is undone. Asking the North to accept a queen is asking the North to accept what the North has defined itself against. Then I don't ask the North to kneel, I ask the North to stand beside me. Standing beside and kneeling below look different from the same height. From above, from the Iron Throne, standing beside is kneeling. From below, from Winterfell, kneeling is standing. The perspective is the problem. Missandei spoke third. The scribe whose mind was the sharpest non-military mind in Daenerys' council. The mind that processed language and culture, and the subtleties that military minds overlooked, because military minds processed the world in terms of force, and Missandei's mind processed it in terms of meaning. This man, this king, sends his mother's kin as envoy. The Mormont lady. He does not send a herald or a lesser lord, he sends a woman who shares blood with your advisor. The choice communicates. The offer is real. The offer is family. The offer bridges the gap between your world and his. The gap is the narrow sea. The gap is 300 years of history. The sea is the easy part. Daenerys made the decision on the 5th day. The decision was not acceptance. The decision was not refusal. The decision fell between acceptance and refusal, the stance that queens employed when the answer required more information than the question had provided. "Tell your king," Daenerys said to Magi Mormont, in the audience hall, with the court watching and the dragons circling above the pyramid and the weight of 300 years of Targaryen history pressing on the words. "Tell your king that the dragon does not refuse the wolf. The dragon requires the wolf's presence. If Robb Stark wants this marriage, Robb Stark comes to Dragonstone, the ancestral seat of House Targaryen. The place where Aegon planned the conquest. The place where the marriage, if the marriage happens, begins. Dragonstone is held by Stannis Baratheon. Dragonstone will be held by me. By the time your king reaches its shores, Dragonstone will be Targaryen again. I am coming to Westeros, Lady Mormont. With or without the North. The question is not whether I cross the narrow sea. The question is what I find when I arrive. You'll find a king. I'll find a wolf. Whether the wolf becomes a husband depends on the wolf." Magi held the answer. The answer that was not yes and was not no, but was, "Come." The answer that said, "I am interested, but I am not submitting. I am moving, but I am not yielding. Come to me. Meet me, and we will see whether the wolf and the dragon can share a den. I'll carry the word," Magi said. "Carry the word." "And carry this," Daenerys stood. The standing, the queen rising from the bench, the small body filling the enormous space with the authority that bodies produced when the bodies belonged to people who had earned the right to fill spaces. "Carry this. I remember what the Starks suffered under my father. I remember the burning. I remember the madness. I am not my father. The sins are his. The throne is mine. The distinction is the thing I am building this reign on. If your king can see the distinction, if the wolf can separate the daughter from the father, then the marriage has a foundation. The wolf separates. The wolf is a Stark. Starks judge men and women by their actions, not their blood. Good, because my blood is fire, and my actions will be justice." Magi sailed from Meereen on the 7th day. The return journey, 6 weeks of open water, the same salt and wind and horizon that the outbound journey had provided, but different now, because the cargo was different. The outbound cargo had been furs and amber and a proposal. The return cargo was an answer. The answer was, "Come." The fray. What the broken oath produced, Magi's return to Riverrun produced two things. The first was relief, the relief that the proposal had not been rejected, that the Dragon Queen had not laughed at the Wolf King's offer, that the crossing of the narrow sea had produced not silence, but an invitation. Come, the word that was not yes, but was the road to yes, the word that opened the door that the Northern Lords had expected to remain shut. The second was the problem of Walder Frey. The problem was not new. The problem had existed since the moment Robb's War Council had discussed the Targaryen proposal, the moment when the Blackfish had said marry the dragon and the room had heard the unspoken corollary and break the oath to the fray. The problem had been deferred, as War Councils deferred problems that did not require immediate solution, filed behind the more pressing question of whether Daenerys would accept. Daenerys had accepted. The deferral was over. The problem was now. Walder Frey, Robb said. In the war room. The same room, the same maps, the same lords, but different now because the decision had been made, and the decision changed everything that came after it. I swore to marry his daughter. The price of the twins. The price was too high, the Blackfish said. We didn't know it then. We know it now. The price was the price. I swore the oath. Before witnesses. Before gods who also watched the Freys sit out Robert's rebellion until the fighting was done. Before gods who watched Walder Frey calculate his loyalty like a merchant calculates a ledger. The gods understand oath-breaking, Your Grace, because the gods have watched the Freys break oath since the twins were built. The phrase oath-breaking does not justify mine. Catelyn spoke. The mother whose counsel carried the weight that mother's counsel carried, the weight that was not political but personal, The weight of the woman who had raised the boy and who knew the boy's honor was not performance, but identity. Your honor is real, Catelyn said. The oath is real. But the choice you face, is not between honor and dishonor. The choice is between two duties, the duty to Walder Frey, who holds a bridge, and the duty to the north, which holds your crown. The bridge is one crossing. The crown is a kingdom. When duties conflict, a king chooses the larger duty. My father would not have broken the oath. Your father would not have been in the position to break it. Your father would not have crossed the twins without finding another way. But your father is not here, and the war has narrowed the roads, and the road you're on leads either to a Frey bride or to 3 dragons. The choice is yours. The consequences are also yours. But the counsel I give as your mother and your advisor, the counsel is, choose the dragons. Robb chose the dragons. The choosing cost, and Robb paid in the currency that was most valuable to a Stark, honor. The choosing broke an oath, and the breaking of an oath was what Ned Stark had taught his children was the one act a man could not do and remain the man he claimed to be. Robb broke the oath. And the breaking, the moment where the raven was sent, the raven that carried Robb's words to the twins, it left a wound that would scar. The raven carried terms. Compensation, gold, land, a different marriage. Edmure Tully, Lord of Riverlands, offered to Walder Frey's daughter. A lord paramount for a king, a lesser exchange, but an exchange that elevated the Freys into the ruling family of the Riverlands, a prize that any lord in the 7 kingdoms would have accepted. Walder Frey was not any lord. The response came in 3 days. The response was Walder Frey's response. The response of a man whose pride was larger than his castle, and whose grievances were older than his children, and whose capacity for insult was the capacity of a man who had spent 90 years accumulating slights, and who counted each one with the precision that other men applied to gold. The response was refusal. Not bare refusal. Walder Frey did not simply say no. Walder Frey said no with the elaboration that Walder Frey applied to everything. The listing of grievances, the enumeration of insults, the catalogue of promises broken and dignities denied, and the long, detailed, vindictive recitation of every moment when House Frey had been treated as lesser by the houses that House Frey served. Was how the Blackfish summarized the response, reading the Raven's scroll in the war room. The old weasel is offended. The old weasel has a right to be offended, Catelyn said. We broke an oath. The old weasel has a right to his feelings. The old weasel does not have a right to endanger the alliance. The question is, what does Walder Frey do with his offense? Does he sulk? Does he close the twins? Does he find someone else to sell his loyalty to? Bolton said. The room held the statement. Bolton's statement, the statement that carried the weight of Bolton's assessment, the assessment that was always the assessment of a man who understood betrayal because Bolton understood the calculations that produced betrayal. Bolton understood the calculations because Bolton performed them, and the man who performed the calculations recognized the calculations in others. Tywin, Robb said. Tywin, Bolton's confirmation. The pale eyes, the eyes that saw the political landscape as a mapmaker, saw terrain, from above, with the distances measured, and the obstacles marked, and the paths between obstacles identified. Walder Frey, insulted by the Starks, approaches Tywin Lannister. Tywin Lannister, seeking to break the Northern Alliance, welcomes the approach. The combination, Frey vindictiveness and Lannister strategy, produces the threat. What kind of threat? The kind that the twins enable. The Freys control the crossing. The crossing controls movement. Movement controls supply. A hostile Frey at the twins doesn't need to fight us. A hostile Frey at the twins cuts us off. The North from the Riverlands. The king from his kingdom. The threat was real. The threat was the consequence of the oath breaking. The price that Robb had paid when he chose the dragons over the bridge. The price that Catelyn had warned about and that the Blackfish had dismissed. And that Bolton, with the calculator's precision, now quantified. Then we secure the twins, the Blackfish said. The twins cannot be secured from the outside. The twins are the most defensible position in the Riverlands, twin castles on opposite banks with the bridge between. You can't take the twins without a siege. A siege takes months. Months we don't have. Then we bypass the twins. Go around. Go around means march north through the swamps. The neck. The route is longer, harder, and more vulnerable. Moat Catelyn defends the north from southern invasion, but it doesn't defend the north from a Frey who controls the easier route. Then we manage the Freys, as the Freys have always been managed, Catelyn said. Through family, through obligation, through the complicated web of marriages and debts and promises that the Riverlands have used to keep the Freys in line for 300 years. Edmure. The offer still stands. Edmure, for a Frey daughter. Lord Paramount of the Riverlands married into House Frey. The offer is significant. The offer, combined with an apology, a personal apology from Robb. Delivered with the sincerity that Starks are known for, the offer and the apology together may be enough. Edmure hasn't agreed. Edmure will agree. Edmure is my brother. Edmure understands duty. And Edmure, Catelyn paused. The pause that was not hesitation but recalibration, the Tully mind adjusting the approach. Edmure will agree, because Edmure understands that the alternative is a hostile Frey at the twins, and a hostile Frey at the twins is a threat that Edmure, as Lord of Riverrun, cannot afford. Edmure agreed. Not happily. Edmure Tully's agreement was the agreement of a man who understood that duty and happiness operated on different schedules, and that duty's schedule was the one that lords followed. Edmure agreed to marry Roslyn Frey, the girl he had never met, the daughter of a lord he despised, the bride who was the price of his nephew's freedom to marry the Dragon Queen. The wedding was arranged. The wedding, Edmure's wedding, not Robb's, was what would repair the damage that Robb's decision had created. The wedding at the twins would demonstrate that the Stark-Tully alliance valued the Freys, honored the Freys, included the Freys in the family that governed the North and the Riverlands. The wedding would be the peace offering. The peace offering required attendance. Robb's attendance, the king himself, present at the twins, demonstrating the respect that the broken oath had damaged. The attendance was the statement, I broke my word, and I am here to make it right. The statement required presence. The presence required trust. Robb would go to the twins. Robb would attend Edmure's wedding. Robb would apologize to Walder Frey in person. With the directness that the Starks applied to the things that cost them, the directness that said, I was wrong. I broke my oath. I offer this in its place. And then Robb would ride south. To Dragonstone. To the Dragon Queen. To the marriage that the broken oath had made possible. Bolton watched the planning. Bolton calculated the exposure, the king at the twins, surrounded by Freys, dependent on guest right and Walder Frey's wounded hospitality. Bolton calculated the vulnerability. Bolton filed the calculation. The filing was what Bolton did, the preparation for possibilities that Bolton did not act on, but did not discard. The filing said, the king will be at the twins. The king will be vulnerable. The vulnerability is an opportunity. The opportunity exists. But the dragons also existed. The dragons, the 3 growing weapons that the Targaryen queen was bringing to Westeros. The dragons changed the filing. The dragons changed the filing because the dragons changed the consequence of acting on the opportunity. In the world without dragons, the opportunity at the twins led to a new Lord Paramount of the North and a grateful Tywin Lannister. In the world with dragons, the opportunity at the twins led to dragonfire and the end of House Bolton. Bolton refiled. The refiling said, the opportunity exists. The consequence has changed. The change makes the opportunity unprofitable. The unprofitable opportunity is filed but not pursued. Bolton waited. The wedding at the twins was 3 weeks away. The dragons were 3 months away. 3 months being the time Daenerys needed to organize her fleet, settle Meereen's governance, and cross the narrow sea. The gap between the wedding and the dragons was the gap between vulnerability and safety. 3 weeks to the twins. 3 months to the dragons. The gap was where the danger lived. Robb did not see the gap. Robb saw the road, the twins, the apology, The ride south, the meeting with Daenerys, the marriage, the war. The road was clear. The road was planned. The road did not account for what roads never account for, the plans of other travelers. Catelyn saw the gap. "The twins worry me," Catelyn said. To Robb, in the Lord's chambers in Riverrun, the mother and the king. The conversation that happened without the war council, without the lords, without the performance that councils demanded. The private council that was also the private worry. The twins have always worried you. The twins have always been Walder Frey's leverage. The bridge is the power. The power is what Walder Frey uses to extract what he wants. And what Walder Frey wants now is revenge. Guest right. Guest right is the law. Guest right says that the host who feeds his guest cannot harm his guest under his roof. Guest right is sacred. Then, guest right is sacred. And Walder Frey is not. Robb went to the twins. Robb went because the road required it, and because the king's duty required it, and because the honor that the broken oath had damaged required repair, and the repair required presence. Robb went with his army, the northern host, the Stark banners, the forces that had won every battle, and that marched now not to war, but to a wedding. The army that was escort and protection, and the visible demonstration of the king's power. The power that said, "I come to your hall in good faith," and the good faith is backed by 20,000 soldiers camped outside your gates. The wedding happened. Edmure married Roslyn Frey. The bride was young and pretty and frightened as brides were frightened when the marriage was not love but politics, when the groom was not chosen but assigned, when the wedding was not celebration but transaction. Edmure was gentle with her. The gentleness that was Edmure's best quality. The quality that made Edmure a poor general and a good man. The quality that the Tully tendency toward politics sometimes obscured. Walder Frey presided. The Lord of the Crossing, 90 years old, sharp as a blade and twice as cutting. The Lord whose hall was full of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and whose hospitality was the hospitality of a man who measured every cup of wine against the debt he believed the world owed him. Walder Frey presided over the wedding, and Walder Frey watched Robb Stark, and Walder Frey calculated. The calculation was the calculation of revenge. The calculation of a man whose pride had been wounded and whose capacity for wounding back was the capacity that generations of Frey marginalization had sharpened into something that was not a sword, but was equally dangerous. The weapon of a man who controlled a bridge and a hall and a guest right that he was considering, for the first time in his long and vindictive life, breaking. But the calculation also included the dragons. The dragons were not in the hall. The dragons were not in Westeros. The dragons were months away, across the narrow sea, growing, approaching. The dragons were future. The revenge was present, and Walder Frey, the man who had waited out Robert's rebellion, who had delayed his march until every battle was decided, Walder Frey was, despite the vindictiveness, a man who calculated consequences. The consequence of acting at the twins, the consequence of what Bolton had filed and that Tywin had suggested, the consequence was dragonfire. Not now. Later. But later was the timeline on which consequences operated, and consequences were what Walder Frey, for all his vindictiveness, respected. The king in the north, Walder Frey said. At the feast, the toast that was required, and that Walder Frey delivered with the tone that Walder Frey applied to everything. The tone that was 2 parts contempt, and 1 part obsequiousness, and 1 part the ancient Frey grievance that was older than most of the people in the hall. The king in the north, who promised to marry my daughter, and who decided my daughter wasn't good enough. Lord Frey, don't apologize. The apology is accepted. Was accepted when Lord Tully married my Roslyn. Pretty girl. Prettier than the king deserved. The king gets his dragon. My Roslyn gets a Lord Paramount. Everyone gets something. The world is full of getting. The world is full of, but not forgetting. The world is not full of forgetting. I don't forget. The was Walder Frey's signature. The sound that was not laughter, but the echo of laughter. the sound that accompanied every statement like a punctuation mark that said, "I am Walder Frey, and I find the world amusing in its cruelty, and the amusement is my weapon." Robb endured the feast. Enduring was the king's burden, sitting in the hall of the man he had wronged, and absorbing the wronged man's contempt, and maintaining the composure that the crown demanded. Robb endured because enduring was the price, and because the price had been accepted, and because the road beyond the twins led to Dragonstone and the Dragon Queen, and the alliance that the enduring purchased. The wedding concluded without blood. The wedding concluded without blood because Walder Frey had calculated the dragons, and because the dragons, even absent, even months away, even theoretical, the dragons were the weight on the scale that tipped Walder Frey's vindictiveness from action to inaction. The old man sulked. The old man het. The old man counted the insult and added it to the ledger that Walder Frey kept in the place where other men kept their hearts. But the old man did not act. Robb rode south from the twins. Alive, the army behind him, the Riverlands around him, the road ahead. The road to Dragonstone. The road to the dragon. Bolton rode behind the king. The Pale Lord, the man who had filed the opportunity and who had watched the opportunity not materialize because the dragons had changed the mathematics. Bolton rode, and Bolton calculated, and Bolton arrived at the number that the dragons produced. Loyalty was profitable. Loyalty remained the winning position. The dragons ensured it. Bolton would remain loyal. For now, the crossing. What the dragon brought to the wolf's shore. Daenerys Targaryen crossed the narrow sea on a morning that tasted of salt and destiny, and the 300 years of history that the crossing reversed. The fleet was not large. 93 ships, the trading vessels and warships that Daenerys had commandeered, purchased, and in some cases liberated from the slavers of Yunkai and Astapor. 93 ships carrying 8,000 unsullied, 2,000 freedmen soldiers, 500 Dothraki riders, the advisors and translators and administrators that a conquering queen required. And 3 dragons. The dragons flew. The dragons did not ride in the ships. The dragons were too large for the ships, and too wild for confinement, and too glorious for the holds that the ships offered. The dragons flew above the fleet in circles that were both patrol and display, the display that said, to any ship that watched the fleet pass, the legends are real. The dragons have returned. The world that existed before this morning is not the world that exists after. Dragonstone appeared on the horizon like a prophecy fulfilled. The island, the volcanic peak that rose from Blackwater Bay like a fist of black stone, the island that Aegon the Conqueror had used as his base before the conquest, the island that generations of Targaryens had governed as their ancestral seat, the island that Stannis Baratheon had held since Robert's rebellion. Dragonstone appeared, and Daenerys saw it, and the seeing was the feeling that the word home described, except that Daenerys had never lived here, and the home was not the physical place, but the idea that said, your family built this. Your blood shaped this stone. The dragons that carved the walls for you. Stannis Baratheon was not on Dragonstone. Stannis had marched north, the march to the wall that the intelligence from Westeros had described, the march that had taken Stannis and his army away from the island and left only a garrison that watched 93 ships approach and 3 dragons circle above, and that made the decision that garrisons made when the force opposing them was overwhelming, and the lord they served was 1,000 miles away. They surrendered. And at the wall that Stannis had marched toward, Jon Snow served. Robb's brother. The half-brother who had taken the black while Robb had taken a crown. The brother whose absence from the war had been a wound that Robb carried beneath the larger wounds of Ned's death and Winterfell's fall. Jon was at Castle Black. Jon was alive. The ravens from the wall had confirmed it, confirmed that Jon Snow had risen in the Night's Watch, that Jon had fought wildlings beyond the wall, that Jon had become the kind of man that the Watch produced from Stark blood, hard, capable, alone. Robb thought of Jon when the dragons flew above Dragonstone, thought of the brother who would have stood beside him at the War Council. who would have assessed the maps with the tactical mind that Jon possessed and that Robb missed. Thought of the brother who could not leave the wall because the wall demanded its own loyalty, its own oath, its own forever. When the war was won, if the war was won, Robb would find a way to bring Jon south. Not from the Watch. The Watch did not release its brothers. But there were ways. Kings found ways, and Robb was king. The surrender was bloodless. Daenerys demanded it that way. The demand that was the policy that said, I conquer without cruelty, when cruelty is not required. The garrison laid down arms. The garrison was offered the choice, bend the knee or leave. Most bent. Some left. The bending and the leaving were equally acceptable. Daenerys did not need the men. Daenerys needed the island. Daenerys took the island. It marked a beginning. Not the beginning of the conquest. The conquest had begun in Astapor, in the moment when Daenerys had spoken the word Dracarys, and the dragon had burned the slaver, and the burning had been the declaration that said, I am not a girl to be traded. I am the dragon. Taking Dragonstone marked a different beginning. The Westerosi campaign. The alliance, what the marriage would build. Daenerys stood in the chamber of the painted table. The room, the war room that Aegon had built. The room with the table that was carved in the shape of Westeros. Every mountain and river and castle sculpted into the wood, with the detail that obsession produced. The table that Aegon had used to plan the conquest. The table that showed Westeros the way a dragon saw it. From above, with the borders erased and the kingdoms laid out like pieces on a game board. Daenerys looked at the north. The vast shape on the table, larger than all the other kingdoms combined. The region that stretched from the neck to the wall. The region that Robb Stark held, and that Robb Stark would bring to the alliance. The north on the painted table was green and brown and enormous. And Daenerys put her hand on it and felt the wood that was not the north, but was the idea of the north, and thought, this is what I am marrying. Not a man. A kingdom. The kingdom is the man, and the man is the kingdom, and the marriage is both. Your Grace. Barristan. In the doorway, the old knight whose presence in the chamber was the presence of history, the man who had stood in this room before, who had served Targaryens in this castle, who had watched Rhaegar brood over these maps, and who now watched Rhaegar's sister plan from the same table. He looked like this, Barristan said. Rhaegar, standing at this table, planning. Your brother planned his wars the way you plan yours, with the map and the mind and the distance that the table provided, the distance that let him see the whole. Rhaegar lost. Rhaegar lost because Rhaegar's plans did not include Robert Baratheon's rage. The rage was the variable that the planning missed. Your plans include the Starks. The Starks are not a variable. The Starks are an ally. The difference between your plan and Rhaegar's is, your plan accounts for the North. Rhaegar's did not. Rhaegar's plan included a Stark. A different kind of inclusion. Lyanna, yes, the name that haunted the dynasty. The name that had started the rebellion and ended the peace, and that echoed through the years between then and now. Rhaegar included Lyanna. But inclusion and alliance are not the same thing. Rhaegar included Lyanna as a person. You include the North as a kingdom. The scale is different. And the scale is what matters. Robb Stark arrived at Dragonstone 14 days after Daenerys. He arrived by ship, a northern galley out of White Harbour, the kind of ship that the North built for the cold waters of the Bight, and that looked, beside the sleek Essos vessels in Dragonstone's harbour, like a bear beside a pack of hounds. Heavy, broad, ungraceful, northern, Robb arrived with 50 men. Not an army, an escort. The choice was deliberate. Arriving with an army said, I don't trust you. Arriving with 50 men said the trust is offered. The 50 men were enough for dignity and insufficient for threat. The 50 men were the statement. Grey Wind was with him. The direwolf, the massive beast whose presence at Robb's side was the presence that had earned Robb the name Young Wolf, the beast whose golden eyes assessed every room and every person with the predator's evaluation that was instinct rather than thought. Grey wind padded beside Robb on the stone dock of Dragonstone, and the direwolf's nostrils flared, and the flaring was the scent of dragon, the scent that was sulphur and heat, and the ancient smell that wolves had never encountered, because dragons had been dead for a century and a half, and the meeting of wolf and dragon was the meeting of two impossibilities. Grey wind growled. Low, continuous, the vibration that travelled through the wolf's massive body and into the stone of the dock and into the air itself. The growl was not aggression. The growl was assessment. The growl said, I smell something larger than me. The something is above. The something is fire. The fire is not prey. The fire is not enemy. The fire is other. The other requires watching. Robb put his hand on Grey Wind's neck. The calming, the king's touch on the wolf's fur, the connection between the Stark and the direwolf that was not ownership, but partnership. Not mastery, but the bond that the old magic of the North produced between the Stark children and the wolves that the Stark children had found. Easy, Robb said. To the wolf, the word that was not a command, but a reassurance. The reassurance that said, I smell it too. The fire, the other. What we're walking toward will change everything. Easy, the dragon appeared. Not all three. Drogon, the black dragon, the largest. The one that answered to Daenerys the way Grey Wind answered to Robb, not through obedience but through bond, through the connection that was blood and fire, and the old magic that the world had thought extinct, and that had returned in eggs and direwolf pups, and the strange impossible present tense that the world now occupied. Drogon landed on the wall above the dock. The landing, the massive black body settling onto the battlements with the weight and the heat that the dragon produced. The wings folding like sails being furled. The eyes, red black eyes. The eyes that were fire itself, contained in sockets. The eyes found Grey Wind, and the direwolf found the dragon, and the two animals locked eyes across a recognition that was older than humanity, older than Westeros. The gaze of predator and predator across the gap that species and scale produced. Grey Wind did not attack. Grey Wind did not flee. Grey Wind stood beside Robb, and the growl continued. Lower now, steadier, the vibration becoming not threat but acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that said, you are what you are. I am what I am. The territory is shared. The sharing is new. The newness requires watching. Drogon screamed. The sound, the dragon's sound. The sound that was not a roar, but a scream. The sound that split the salt air above Dragonstone's harbour, and that produced in every human within earshot the primal, ancient, bone-deep response that the human animal had carried since the first fire had burned the first cave, and the first dragon had cast the first shadow. The sound was the dragon's assessment of the wolf. The assessment was acceptable. Not friendly, not welcoming, acceptable, the dragon's version of Grey Wind's acknowledgement. You are what you are. The territory is shared. The sharing is tolerated. The tolerance is conditional. Robb Stark looked up at the dragon, and the dragon looked down at Robb Stark, and the looking was the moment. The moment where the Wolf King saw the dragon, and the dragon saw the Wolf King, and both understood what the marriage would formalize. The alliance was not between two people. The alliance was between two forces. The wolf and the dragon. The cold and the fire. The north and the throne. That's the dragon, Robb said. That's the dragon, the Blackfish confirmed, standing beside his king. The veteran whose assessment of Drogon was the military assessment. The assessment that said that creature changes everything. Every castle, every army, every strategic calculation in Westeros just became irrelevant. The dragon is the only piece on the board that matters. It's bigger than I expected. It's growing. Yes, everything about this is growing. The meeting. What the wolf and the dragon found in each other, they met in the chamber of the painted table. The choice of room was Daenerys's, the queen's prerogative, the host's privilege. The statement that said, I receive you in the room where the conquest was planned, because I am the Targaryen who plans the next one. The room communicated. The room was the message. Robb entered. The entering was what novels would describe as dramatic. The young king walking into the Dragon Queen's chamber, the direwolf at his side, the auburn hair and the tully blue eyes and the crown. The entering was the moment where two stories that had been running on opposite sides of the world converged into one story. Daenerys stood at the far end of the table between them, Westeros between them. The painted kingdoms that both claimed and that neither held, and that the marriage was the attempt to share. She wore black and red, the Targaryen colors, the dragon's colors, the colors that said, "I am what my blood says I am." The silver hair, unbound, falling past her shoulders. The violet eyes that held Robb Stark's blue eyes across the length of the painted table and that assessed what the eyes found. The assessment was mutual. Robb saw a girl, young, younger than expected, younger than the legend suggested, younger than the conqueror of 3 cities should have been. Small, physically small, in the way that Arya was small. The smallness that did not reduce but concentrated. The smallness that packed an entire personality into a body that the personality exceeded, silver and violet, and the expression that was not cold but controlled. The control that was the control of a woman who had learned that the world used emotional display as weakness, and who had armored the display without eliminating the emotion. Daenerys saw a boy, young as her, younger perhaps, with the youth that warfare had not erased, but had sharpened, the way the smith's hammer sharpened the blade rather than flattening it. Tall, auburn-haired, built like a fighter, the body that was not a knight's body but a warrior's body. The crown sat on his head with the weight that crowns carried when the crowns were real and the weight was earned. And the eyes that were his mother's eyes, Tully eyes, the eyes that saw through politics and processed through calculation, the eyes held intelligence. "Your Grace," Robb said. "Your Grace," Daenerys replied. The symmetry was deliberate. 2 graces, 2 crowns, 2 rulers who addressed each other as equals because neither would address the other as superior. The symmetry was also the difficulty. 2 graces meant 2 claims, and 2 claims meant one of 2 things: division or resolution. The marriage attempted resolution. The meeting began it. "You're younger than I expected," Daenerys said. "So are you. The world expects its conquerors to be old. The world expects wrong. The world has been expecting wrong since Aegon crossed the narrow sea at 7 and 20. Youth is not weakness. No, youth is speed. Youth is the willingness to move before the old men decide that movement is appropriate. The old men are still deciding. We're already here." Daenerys held the response. The holding, the queen's assessment of the king's intelligence, the measurement that said, "This one is fast. This one matches speed for speed." The speed is not arrogance. The speed is ability. The ability is real. "Your aunt was impressive," Daenerys said. "Lady Mormont. She negotiated well. The Mormonts don't negotiate. The Mormonts state their position and wait for the world to agree. The world doesn't always agree. The Mormonts don't always care." The distance, the length of the painted table between them, Westeros spread like a boundary. The distance held. Neither moved toward the other. The not moving was the negotiation in physical form. "I will not cross first." The crossing first was the yielding, and neither would yield. Robb crossed, not from weakness, from strategy. The king who had won every battle understood what the Greatjon and the Karstark and the proud northern lords would not have understood, that crossing a room was not submission, that walking toward a queen was not kneeling, that the man who moved first controlled the movement, and the control of movement was the control of the encounter. Robb walked the length of the painted table, past the Westerlands, past the Riverlands, past the Crownlands, past the painted kingdoms that the walk symbolized, the walk that was not surrender but approach, not kneeling but standing closer. He stopped at the north, the massive green-brown shape on the table between them, the kingdom he held, the kingdom she wanted. "The north," Robb said, his hand on the painted wood, "the claim, the physical claim, the hand on the territory. This is mine. This is what you're offering. This is what I'm bringing. The offering is the alliance, The North is the foundation. The distinction matters. The distinction is, you want to keep the crown. The distinction is, the crown is not mine to give. The crown was given to me by my lords. The lords chose me. The crown represents the choice. I cannot surrender the choice without betraying the choosers. The choosers chose a king. Kings marry queens. The marriage creates a realm. The marriage creates an alliance. The realm is the question. The question is whether the realm has one crown or two. Daenerys moved. The movement, the queen stepping closer, the distance between them shrinking from political to personal, the shift that turned the negotiation from abstract to immediate. The movement was Daenerys' answer to Robb's approach. He had crossed. She would close. They stood on opposite sides of the North, the painted kingdom between them, the boundary that was also the bridge, the territory that divided them, and that the marriage would share. I will not pretend the North doesn't exist, Daenerys said. I will not pretend that 7 kingdoms are 6. But I will also not pretend that the marriage is merely military. If we marry, if the wolf marries the dragon, then the marriage creates something. Not a conquest. Not a surrender. Something that Westeros has not seen. A realm where 2 rulers share the ruling, where the crown is not one thing worn by one person, but the agreement between 2 people that the ruling is shared. Shared ruling. The Targaryens have never shared. The Targaryens have never married a king in the North. The marriage is what the sharing requires. The marriage is, Daenerys searched for the word. The searching, the queen's mind, reaching for the term that would capture the idea that the queen's mind had produced. The idea that was not quite alliance, and not quite surrender, and not quite what any word could hold without the word breaking under the weight. The marriage is the experiment. Yes, whether 2 crowns can share a kingdom, whether the wolf and the dragon can rule together without the ruling being a contest. It's new. Nothing like this has been attempted. The risk is the newness. The reward is also the newness. Robb considered. The consideration was the king's work, the work that happened behind the Tully eyes and the Stark jaw, the calculation that weighed the queen's words against the queen's position and found, in the weighing, what the calculation respected: honesty. The queen's honesty, not the diplomatic honesty that told you what you wanted to hear, but the ruler's honesty that told you what was real. The honesty was, I don't know if this works. The honesty was, the not knowing is shared. The honesty was, we try. The arrangement requires terms, Robb said. It requires trust. Trust comes after terms. Terms come first. Then, terms. Daenerys placed her hand on the table, not on the North, on the Crown Lands. The territory that held King's Landing, the territory that held the Iron Throne. Her territory, her claim. The Iron Throne is mine. The 7 kingdoms are mine by right. But the right is not the ruling. The ruling is what we negotiate. The North governs itself. The Stark in Winterfell rules the North as the Starks have always ruled, with northern lords, northern laws, northern customs. The Iron Throne does not reach past the neck. The Iron Throne reaches everywhere. That's the definition of the throne. Then the definition changes. For the North, for the kingdom that the Stark in Winterfell holds, the definition changes from command to partnership. Not submission, partnership. The taxes are negotiated, not imposed. The laws are northern, not southern. The armies are called by request, not by order. Partnership. Daenerys tasted the word. The tasting, the queen testing the word the way a swordsman tested a blade, for weight and balance, and the sharpness that determined whether the word could cut. Partnership is a word that hides a question. The question is, what happens when the partners disagree? The partners negotiate. Negotiation requires compromise. Compromise requires the possibility that one partner yields. If the North never yields, if the Stark in Winterfell never compromises, then the partnership is not partnership. It's independence by another name. And if the Iron Throne never yields, the partnership is not partnership. It's subjugation by another name. The words hung. The hanging. The moment when the negotiations reached the point that negotiations always reached, the point where both sides had stated their positions, and both positions were irreconcilable, and the irreconcilability either broke the negotiation or produced something larger than either position. The compromise. The children, Daenerys said. The children, our children, if we have children, inherit both. The north and the throne. The division ends with us. The crown passes to the child, who is half Stark and half Targaryen, half wolf and half dragon. And the child is the resolution. Not us. We are the bridge. The children are the destination. The bridge carries the weight. The bridge endures the strain. What we endure, the disagreements, the negotiations, the moments when the two crowns pull in opposite directions, what we endure is the price of the destination. Are you willing to pay? I'm here. I crossed the narrow sea. In the wrong direction, but I crossed it. I broke an oath to a Frey to stand in this room. I am willing to pay, because I've already started paying. Daenerys studied the young king across the painted north. The studying, the assessment that was not political, but personal. The woman's assessment of the man beneath the crown. The assessment that asked, who are you? Not what do you want? Who are you? The difference between the questions was the difference between negotiation and marriage, between alliance and partnership, between the political and the personal that the marriage would require. The assessment found honor, not rigid honor. Ned Stark's honor had been rigid, and rigid honor broke. Robb's honor was flexible, the honor that bent without breaking. The honor that could break an oath to a Frey and carry the breaking as a wound rather than a justification. The flexibility was the strength. The wound was the proof of the strength. I have one condition, Daenerys said. Beyond the terms. Beyond the negotiation. Name it. The condition is honesty between us. Not the honesty of the court, the performed honesty that says the right thing at the right time. The honesty of the searching again. The Queen reaching for the personal inside the political. The honesty of two people who are going to share a bed and a war and a future, and who cannot share any of those things if the sharing is built on performance. The Starks don't perform honesty. The Starks just are honest. Good, then be honest. Are you afraid? The question landed. The landing. The impact of the personal question in the political space. The Queen's decision to cut through the negotiation and reach the person. Yes, Robb said. I'm 16. I'm marrying a woman I met an hour ago. I'm marrying into the family my family overthrew. I'm trusting 3 dragons to win a war that I've been fighting for a year without them. I'm afraid. Good, good. I've been afraid since I was 13. Afraid is the condition. Afraid is what happens when the stakes are real. If you weren't afraid, the stakes wouldn't be real, and I'd be marrying a fool. Are you afraid? I walked into fire. I conquered 3 cities. I freed 100,000 slaves. I crossed the narrow sea with 3 dragons and 8,000 soldiers to claim a throne I've never sat on in a kingdom I've never seen. Daenerys looked at the painted table. The painted kingdoms that were hers by blood, and that she would make hers by fire and marriage, and the combination of the two that was the experiment neither of them could predict. Of course I'm afraid. Then we're afraid together. Together is the plan. The meeting ended. The meeting ended not with a handshake or a kiss or the formal conclusion that courts demanded. The meeting ended with 2 young rulers standing on opposite sides of a painted table, with a painted north between them and the understanding, shared, unspoken, as real as the stone beneath their feet, that what they were building was larger than either of them, and that the building was the point, and that the fear was the proof that the point was worth reaching. When the meeting ended, the marriage had already begun. The marriage. What fire and winter made together. The wedding was held in Dragonstone's great hall. The hall that Aegon had built, the hall where dragons were carved into every surface, where the stone breathed fire in the torchlight and the ceiling arched above like the inside of a dragon's ribcage. The hall was the setting that the marriage demanded. Not a sept. Daenerys did not worship the 7. Not a godswood, Dragonstone's trees were not weirwoods, and the old god's eyes did not watch from the island's volcanic stone. The hall was neutral ground, which meant it was Targaryen ground, which meant it was the compromise that began the marriage the way compromises would continue it, imperfectly, but functionally. The ceremony was performed by the Maester of Dragonstone. The Maester, a man who had served Stannis, and who served Daenerys now, because Maesters served the castle, and the castle had changed hands. The Maester spoke the words that weddings required, and that this wedding wore like borrowed clothes. They fit, but they had been made for someone else. The guests were few. Robb sighed, the Blackfish, Mage Mormont, the Great John, Dacy Mormont, Small John Umber. Catelyn had not made the journey south. Catelyn had remained at Riverrun, governing the Riverlands in Robb's absence. The practical decision that was also the political one: someone had to hold the war while the king married the war's newest weapon. Daenerys' side, Barristan Selmy, Jorah Mormont, Missandei, Grey Worm, and the officers of the Unsullied whose names were numbers and whose numbers were a statement, 8,000 soldiers stood behind this bride. The vows were spoken. Robb spoke first. The words were the words, the traditional words, the words that weddings in Westeros had used for centuries, the words that promised and bound and created the legal and spiritual framework that turned two people into one house. Robb spoke the words with the directness that Starks applied to everything. The words meant what they said. He meant every word. Daenerys spoke second. The words were the same words, but the speaking was different. The speaking carried the weight of the Targaryen who had spoken wedding vows before, and who spoke them now in the common tongue to a man she had chosen. The cloak exchange was the moment. Not the vows were words, and words were performance. The cloaks were physical. Robb removed his cloak, the Stark cloak, the grey and white direwolf on a field of snow-coloured wool, and placed it on Daenerys' shoulders. The gesture declared, "This woman is under my protection. This woman carries my house's mark. This woman is Stark." Daenerys allowed the cloak. The allowing was concession, Targaryen concession, the queen submitting to the ritual that said, "The husband protects." The submission was performed, not felt. Daenerys Targaryen did not require protection. Daenerys Targaryen had 3 dragons and 8,000 soldiers and the capacity to protect herself against any threat that Westeros could produce. The cloak was ritual, and ritual required both sides to perform the rituals that the other side needed. Then, Daenerys produced her cloak. The cloak was not expected. The tradition, the Westerosi tradition, had one cloak. The husband's. The wife received the cloak. The wife did not give one. The wife was covered, not covering. Daenerys broke the tradition. The cloak was black and red, the Targaryen colors, the 3-headed dragon embroidered in thread that caught the torchlight and seemed, for a moment, to move. The 3 heads, Balerion, Vhagar, Meraxes, the dragons of the conquest. The 3 heads on the cloth that Daenerys held, and that Daenerys placed on Robb's shoulders with the gesture that said, "The protection is mutual. The covering is shared. The marriage is not the husband sheltering the wife, but 2 people sheltering each other." The Greytion's expression was the expression that the Greytion wore when the world did something the Greytion had not expected, and that the Greytion could not immediately categorize as either good or bad. The expression was confusion, which on the Greytion's face looked like the beginning of anger and the beginning of laughter competing for control of the same features. 2 cloaks, the Greytion said. To Small Jon. At the feast, later, 2 cloaks. She put a dragon cloak on the king in the north. On Robb Stark. A Targaryen cloak on a Stark. She's his wife now. The cloaks are symbols. And the symbol she chose is, "I'm not below you, I'm beside you." The dragon stands next to the wolf. Not behind, next to. Is that bad? Bad? I don't know. The Greytion wrestled with the word. The Greytion's vocabulary was the vocabulary of a man who communicated through volume rather than precision, and precision was what the moment required. It's new. The new thing is, we have a queen who doesn't kneel. The old thing was, queens kneel. The new thing says, this queen stands. The standing is, it's going to be a problem or it's going to be the best thing that ever happened to us. Which one? Ask me after the war. The feast was the feast that Dragonstone could provide, not lavish, not the feast that King's Landing's kitchens could produce, but adequate and honest and flavored with the Essos spices that Daenerys' people had brought, and that the northern lords sampled with the suspicion that northerners applied to all food that was not meat and bread and ale. The Blackfish drank with Barristan. Over wine, the veterans talked. The conversation that happened between men who had spent decades in service and who recognized in each other the quality that service produced, the ability to assess the political through the practical, to see the marriage not as romance or politics but as the military reality it was. 3 dragons, the Blackfish said. I've seen them. Flying above the harbor. The black one, Drogon. The thing is the size of a destroyer already. The size of a destroyer now. The size of Balerion in 10 years. Balerion was large enough to swallow a mammoth whole. The histories say his shadow covered entire towns. And the girl, the queen, she controls them? She rides Drogon. The riding is not control, the riding is partnership. The dragon obeys because the dragon chooses. The choice is the bond. The bond is the blood. The Targaryen blood that connects the dragon rider to the dragon through the old magic that the maesters deny and that the dragons prove. Can anyone else ride them? Targaryen blood. The riding requires Targaryen blood. The other 2 dragons, Rhaegal and Viserion, are unridden. They obey Daenerys, but they do not carry her. The carrying requires a rider. The rider requires the blood. The Blackfish held the implication. The implication was the children, Robb's children, half Stark, half Targaryen. The children who would carry the blood that the dragons required. The children who would, if the blood worked the way the blood had always worked, ride the dragons that their mother had hatched and that their Targaryen inheritance entitled them to command. Stark children on dragonback. The image was the image that the Blackfish, the veteran who had seen every kind of warfare and who had calculated every kind of advantage, the image was what made the Blackfish's old soldier's heart beat faster. Not from sentiment, from strategy, from the understanding that Stark children on dragons was the most powerful military combination that Westeros had ever produced, and that the combination was what the marriage created. The children, the Blackfish said, the children will be extraordinary. The children will be weapons. Barristan's expression shifted. The shift, the old knight's response to the word weapons, applied to children. The response that was both professional and personal. The shift was the tension that the marriage contained, the tension between the alliance's military purpose and the marriage's human reality. The children will be rulers, Barristan corrected. The weapons are incidental. In my experience, the incidental part is the part that wins wars. The wedding night was private. The privacy was absolute, the privacy that Robb demanded and that Daenerys agreed to, the rejection of the bedding ceremony that tradition required, and that neither the king in the north nor the queen of Meereen would submit to. The bedding ceremony, the ritual where the guests stripped the bride and groom and carried them to the marriage bed. The ceremony was a tradition that treated the marriage's consummation as a public act, and neither Robb nor Daenerys would permit the public act that the tradition demanded. No bedding, Robb said, before the feast. No bedding, Daenerys agreed. The marriage is consummated, or it isn't. The consummation is ours, not the court's. What happened in the chamber was the beginning of the personal that the political had created, and that the political would complicate, and that the personal would, in time, either strengthen or destroy. 2 young people in a stone room on a volcanic island, with the sound of waves below and the sound of dragons above. Learning what marriages taught, that sharing a bed was not sharing a life, and that sharing a life was the work that began when the bed was shared, and that continued every morning after. Morning tested them. Robb woke to the sound of dragons, Drogon's scream, the dawn scream that the dragon produced every morning, the sound that was the dragon's rooster crow. The declaration that said, "The sun is up, the dragon is awake," The world belongs to what flies above it. Daenerys was awake, sitting on the chamber's stone windowsill, looking out at the sea, with the Targaryen cloak around her shoulders. "You sleep deeply," Daenerys said. "I'm a soldier. Soldiers sleep when they can. Soldiers sleep because the waking is hard." Yes, Robb sat up. The morning. The first morning of the marriage. The morning that was the beginning of the experiment. The waking is hard. But it's also the point. The point is the war. The point is everything. The war, the marriage, the kingdoms, the thing we're building. All of it starts with waking up and doing the work. Daenerys looked at the young king in her bed, the bed that was now their bed, the bed that was the physical center of the alliance that the marriage had created. She assessed him as the morning permitted, the honest assessment, without the court's eyes, without the council's pressure, without the political performance that the day would require. "You're not what I expected," Daenerys said. "What did you expect? A northern lord, grim, honorable, cold, your father's son. Not in the good ways, but in the stubborn ways. I expected someone who would lecture me about duty and honor and the northern way. My father is dead, because honor without flexibility is death. I loved my father. I will not make his mistakes. His mistakes were the world's mistakes. The world killed your father, not his honor. The world killed my father, because his honor gave the world the opportunity. I will be honorable. I will not be stupid. That's the most un-northern thing I've heard. Then, the North is changing." The morning continued. The morning continued the way mornings continue after the night that changes everything. With the normal things and the awareness, beneath the normal things, that the normal things were different now, because the person walking beside you was different. And the difference was the marriage. And the marriage was what made every normal thing the first version of itself. They walked to the war council together. The king and the queen, the wolf and the dragon, side by side, not one ahead, not one behind, the physical arrangement that the two-cloak ceremony had promised and that the walking delivered. The war council saw the arrangement. The war council assessed the arrangement. The war council understood. This marriage is not the marriage of submission. This marriage is the marriage of two crowns walking at the same speed. The war began. The war. What dragons did to lions. The war that followed the marriage was not the war that had preceded it. The war that preceded it, Robb's war, the Northern War, the war of 40,000 men against the resources of the Westerlands and the Reach. The preceding war had been a war of battles. Whispering Wood, Oxcross, the engagements in the Riverlands that Robb had won through tactical brilliance and that Robb could not convert to strategic victory. Because tactical brilliance, without the resources to exploit it, was the sword that cut, but could not hold. The war that followed the marriage was a different war. The war that followed the marriage had dragons. The campaign opened from Dragonstone, the island, the volcanic seat that sat in Blackwater Bay like a dagger pointed at King's Landing. The island was the staging ground. The combined forces assembled, northern soldiers ferried south from the Riverlands by ship, unsullied drilled on Dragonstone's beaches, the Dothraki riders confined to the castle grounds until the crossing to the mainland. The plan was Robb's. The execution was shared. Robb planned the campaign because Robb was the military mind, the mind that had destroyed Shiny Lannister's host through the combination of speed and deception that the singers called genius and that Robb called preparation. The plan accounted for the dragons, but did not rely on them. The plan used the dragons the way a commander used any weapon, as force applied at the moment of maximum impact, not as the solution to every problem. "The dragons burn what I tell them to burn," Daenerys said. In the War Council, the council that was now combined, Robb's commanders and Daenerys' advisors, the Blackfish and Barristan, Mage Mormont and Grey Worm, the military minds of two continents sitting at the same table and planning the same war. "The dragons burn castles and siege engines and supply trains," Robb said. "The dragons don't burn armies. The dragons can burn armies. The dragons can. The dragons shouldn't." The Field of Fire, Aegon's most terrible battle in Westeros, Aegon used all 3 dragons on the battlefield, burned 4,000 men alive. The burning won the battle. The burning also created the terror. The terror lasted 300 years. 300 years of the realm's people fearing the Targaryens, because the Targaryens burned people. The burning is why the realm rebelled. The burning is why my grandfather died. My father burned your grandfather. The battlefield is different. The battlefield is bodies. Bodies burn the same in combat and in throne rooms. The dead don't care about the distinction. And the living who survived the battle, the soldiers who go home and tell their families what the dragon did, the living carry the story. The story is, the Targaryens burn people. The story undermines the queen we're trying to crown. Daenerys held the argument. She held it, the first test of the marriage's central promise. The promise that said, the partnership is real. The partnership means, I listen when you disagree. I consider when you challenge. I do not burn the person who tells me I'm wrong. Daenerys did not burn the person who told her she was wrong. Daenerys considered. The surgical use Barristan offered. Aegon at Harrenhal. The dragons burned the castle, not the army. The army surrendered because the castle was ash. The burning was targeted. The targeting is the distinction. The distinction is, we burn things, not people, Robb said. Castles, siege towers, ships, the fleet in Blackwater Bay. The walls of King's Landing, if the walls must fall, the dragons melt the walls. But the people behind the walls walk out alive. The people walking out alive is the story. The story is, the Targaryens returned, and the Targaryens came with fire, and the fire destroyed the war without destroying the warriors. That's idealistic. That's strategy. The realm needs to accept you as queen. The realm accepts the queen who conquers. The realm does not accept the queen who massacres. My father taught me, the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. The woman who wears the crown should control the flame. Your father's lessons are, Daenerys searched for the word. The word was relevant. The word was important. The word was what the marriage was building on, the foundation of Ned Stark's honor, applied to the Targaryen restoration. Your father's lessons are the foundation. The fire is the force. The foundation guides the force. The force without the foundation is, Eris, the word landed. The Mad King's name, the name that was the cautionary tale, the name that said, fire without restraint is madness. Fire without honor is tyranny. The name that Daenerys carried and that Daenerys was determined to redeem, and that Robb's invocation was not insult, but reminder. Eris, Daenerys agreed. The fire without the foundation is my father. The fire with the foundation is us, the experiment. The campaign moved. The first target was the Lannister fleet in Blackwater Bay. The fleet, 23 warships and 47 support vessels. The naval presence that defended King's Landing's sea approach and that had been reinforced since Stannis' failed attack at the Battle of the Blackwater. The fleet was anchored in the bay, arrayed in the defensive formation that the fleet's commanders believed would deter naval assault. The fleet's commanders had not considered dragons. Drogon descended on the fleet at dawn. The descent, the dragon dropping from the cloud cover that the morning provided, the massive black shape falling toward the ships like the shadow of the god the Valyrians had worshipped. The descent produced the reaction that Robb had predicted, not the calm, organized response that military training produced, but the primal, animal, scattering panic that the sight of a dragon produced in men who had never seen a dragon and who were not equipped, not physically, not psychologically, not in any dimension that human preparation could address, to respond to the attack that followed. Drogon burned the fleet, not the sailors, the ships, the sails and the masts and the hulls and the rigging, the wood and the cloth and the tar that the ships were made of, and that burned with the speed and the heat that dragonfire provided. Dragonfire was not normal fire. Dragonfire was hotter, faster, more complete. The fire that the Valyrians had used to forge their steel and that the dragons carried in the glands behind the jaw, and that emerged from the mouth as the concentrated heat that could melt stone. And that, applied to wooden ships, produced the instantaneous. Total destruction that the fleet's commanders had not considered because the fleet's commanders did not believe in dragons. The fleet burned 23 warships, 47 support vessels. 70 ships turned to flame and ash, and the floating wreckage that covered Blackwater Bay like a carpet of destruction. The sailors, most of the sailors, survived. The sailors survived because the burning was fast, and because the men jumped into the water, and because Drogon, following Daenerys' command, burned the ships rather than the swimmers. The swimmers were the story. The swimmers were the men who crawled onto the shores of King's Landing and told the city what they had seen. The story spread through King's Landing in hours. The story was, the dragons are here. The Targaryens have returned. The fleet is ash. The bay is open. The city is exposed. The story reached Tywin Lannister. The lion. What Tywin Lannister calculated in the dragon's shadow, Tywin Lannister received the news in the Tower of the Hand. The receiving was what separated Tywin from other men, not the news itself, which was terrible, but the receiving, the processing, the conversion of terrible news into strategic assessment that happened in the space between the words and the response. Other men panicked. Other men raged. Other men, Cersei for instance, whose response to the news that dragons had burned the fleet was the response of a woman whose world was narrowing, and whose narrowing produced the desperation that desperation always produced. Poor decisions made at increasing volume. Tywin did not panic. Tywin did not rage. Tywin received the news and processed the news and arrived at the assessment that the processing produced with the efficiency that 60 years of political warfare had refined to the point where the efficiency was not a quality but an identity. 3 dragons, Tywin said, to no one. In the tower, the chamber where Hands of the King had governed the realm for 3 centuries, and where Tywin governed now, not for the king. Tywin governed for the realm because Tywin was the only person in King's Landing capable of governing, and because governing was what Tywin Lannister did the way breathing was what lungs did, automatically, continuously, as a condition of existence. The assessment of the dragons was the assessment of a military mind confronting a problem that military solutions could not solve. Variable 1. The dragons themselves. 3 dragons, growing, capable of burning fleets and castles. The dragons could not be fought in the air. No weapon in Westeros could reach a flying dragon with the precision required to kill it. The dragons could potentially be killed on the ground, scorpion bolts, the massive crossbow weapons that the histories described Aegon's enemies using, with limited success, against the dragons of the conquest. Potentially, the histories also describe the dragon's scales deflecting scorpion bolts, and the scales strengthening as the dragons grew. The dragons were, for the foreseeable future, unkillable. Variable 2, the alliance. The Stark Targaryen marriage had combined the Northern Army with the Targaryen forces, a combination that produced a ground force capable of meeting Tywin's combined Lannister-Tyrell army in the field. The combination had not existed before the marriage. The marriage created it. The marriage was therefore the strategic threat, not the dragons alone, and not the armies alone, but the combination of dragons and armies that the marriage produced. Variable 3, the political dimension. The Targaryen return changed the political landscape. The Lords of the Seven Kingdoms, the lords who had accepted the Baratheon dynasty after the rebellion, and who had tolerated the Lannister dominance after Robert's death, the lords were now presented with an alternative. The alternative was the Targaryen heir, backed by dragons, married to the king in the north. The alternative was legitimate. The alternative was powerful. The alternative would attract the lords whose loyalty to the Lannisters was not loyalty but calculation, and whose calculation would recalculate when the dragon's shadow fell on the Red Keep. The assessment produced the conclusion. The conclusion was what Tywin Lannister, the most formidable political mind in Westeros, arrived at with the clarity that formidable minds produced in moments of crisis. The clarity that was not denial but acceptance, not surrender but the honest evaluation of the position. The position was, the field battle was unwinnable. Not today. The dragons were not yet large enough. The alliance was not yet organized enough. The campaign had not yet progressed enough for the field battle to be the immediate threat. But the trajectory, the direction that the variables pointed, the trajectory said, the field battle will become unwinnable. The dragons will grow. The alliance will solidify. The campaign will advance. And when the field battle comes, when the combined forces of the Stark Targaryen alliance march on King's Landing with 3 dragons overhead, the field battle will be Tywin Lannister's last. Tywin did not accept unwinnable positions. Tywin transformed unwinnable positions into winnable ones. The transformation required changing the variables. The alliance, Tywin said, to Kevan. Kevan Lannister, Tywin's brother, the reliable instrument, the man whose competence was the competence of execution rather than invention. The man who did what Tywin told him to do with the precision that the telling required. The alliance is the vulnerability. The dragons cannot be killed. The armies cannot be defeated in the field, not with dragons overhead. The alliance can be broken. Broken how? The alliance is built on a marriage. The marriage is built on a compromise. The compromise that gives the North its independence in exchange for the North's support. The compromise is the flaw. The compromise requires both parties to accept something they don't want. Daenerys Targaryen accepts a divided kingdom. Robb Stark accepts a Targaryen queen. The acceptance is fragile. The fragility is the opportunity. The Freys are a splinter. The Freys are a nuisance. The Freys are the wound that the breaking of Robb Stark's oath has opened, and the wound can be infected. The Northern Lords. The Northern Lords are the lever. The Grietjon Umber did not crown a king in the north so that the king in the north could marry a Targaryen queen. The Grietjon crowned a king so that the north could be free of southern rule. The marriage puts the north back under southern rule, Targaryen rule, dragon rule, the rule that the north fought a war to escape. The northern lords will tolerate the marriage as long as the marriage produces victory. The moment the marriage produces cost, the moment the compromise costs the north something, the northern lords will remember why they crowned a king in the first place. And if the marriage holds, then we negotiate. A Lannister who cannot win the field negotiates the table. The negotiation is the secondary strategy. The primary strategy is break the alliance. If the alliance breaks, the war reverts to the war we were winning. The Northern Army without dragons. The Northern Army that cannot take King's Landing. The Northern Army that runs out of time and gold and men before Tywin Lannister runs out of any of the 3. Tywin's plan was the plan of a mind that did not concede but adapted. The plan deployed 3 instruments. Instrument 1, the Ravens. Ravens sent north, not to Robb's camp, but to the Northern Lords. The lords who had marched south for independence, and who now found independence married to a Targaryen queen. The Ravens did not propose betrayal. The Ravens proposed doubt. The doubt was, has your king sold the north to a Targaryen? The doubt was the seed. The seed required time to grow. The time was what Tywin was buying. Instrument 2, the Tyrells. Mace Tyrell, the Lord of Highgarden. The man whose alliance with Tywin was the alliance of ambition married to power. The Tyrells wanted a queen on the Iron Throne. Margaery Tyrell was engaged to Joffrey. The Targaryen return threatened the Tyrell position. If Daenerys took the throne, Margaery's engagement was ash. The Tyrells' loyalty to Tywin was contingent on Tywin's ability to deliver the throne. If Tywin could not deliver, if the dragons burned the delivery, then the Tyrells would recalculate, and the recalculation might produce the Tyrells siding with Daenerys. The instrument was, keep the Tyrells committed. Keep Mace Tyrell convinced that the Lannisters could win. Keep the Tyrell armies in the field. Instrument 3, time. Time was Tywin's oldest weapon, the weapon that the Battle of the Bells and the Siege of Castamere and 30 years of political warfare had taught Tywin to wield with the patience that the weapon required. Time said, the alliance is new. New alliances are fragile. The fragility increases under pressure. Apply pressure. not military pressure, not the pressure of battles that the dragons would win, but the pressure of time itself. Let the alliance age. Let the compromise grate. Let the two crowns, the wolf's crown and the dragon's crown, rub against each other until the rubbing produced the friction that friction always produced, heat. And heat, ironic, given the dragons, heat was what broke alliances. Tywin waited. Waiting was strategy, weapon, and instinct. What the lions did when the dragons flew overhead, the lions waited in the rock, in the stone, in the castles that the dragons could burn but that the lions could rebuild. And the lions waited for what time always provided, the mistake. The campaign. What the wolf planned, the dragon delivered. The campaign moved south from Dragonstone in 3 columns. Column 1, the Northern Army. 22,000 men, the core of Robb's host, the soldiers who had marched from Winterfell and who had fought the war from the Whispering Wood to the Riverlands, and who now marched the direction they had been marching since the crowning, south, toward King's Landing, toward the end of the Lannister hold on the Iron Throne. The Northern Army was the anvil, the force that held the line, that engaged the enemy, that pinned the Lannister forces in place. Column 2, the unsullied 8,000 soldiers, the disciplined infantry that Daenerys had freed from the slavers of Astapor and that Grey Worm commanded with the precision that the Unsullied brought to everything. The lockstep march, the shield wall, the spear line that was not a formation but a machine. The machine that ground opposing forces the way a mill ground grain, steadily and without mercy. The Unsullied were the hammer, the force that struck where the anvil held. Column 3, the dragons. 3 dragons, Drogon, Rhaegal, Viserion, flying above the columns, circling the campaign's advance like the eagles that circled battlefields, waiting for the dying. The dragons were not the anvil or the hammer. The dragons were what the enemy could not prepare for, and could not defend against, and could not survive. The weapon that rewrote every tactical calculation that the Lannister commanders had made, and that the rewriting made irrelevant. Robb commanded the campaign. Daenerys commanded the dragons. The division of authority that the marriage had negotiated and that the War Council had formalized. The division was the compromise in action. Robb planned the battles. Daenerys delivered the fire. The planning and the delivering were separate authorities that the marriage joined, and the joining was what made the campaign different from every campaign that Westeros had seen. The first land battle was at the Blackwater Rush. The Blackwater Rush, the river that ran south of King's Landing, the river that was the city's natural defense, the crossing that Stannis had failed to force during the Battle of the Blackwater. The Lannister Tyrell force, 35,000 men under the command of Randyll Tarly, the force was arrayed on the north bank, defending the crossing. The defense was conventional. The defense assumed conventional attack. The defense did not assume dragons. Robb's plan was not conventional. The feint is the Northern Army, Robb explained. In the command tent, the tent that was the War Council's mobile equivalent of Riverlands' war room, maps and markers and the faces of commanders who were about to fight the battle that would determine the campaign. 22,000 men approached the rush from the south. Standard formation. Tarly sees 22,000 Northerners and prepares for a river crossing. Standard defense. And the Unsullied? The Unsullied cross upstream, 5 miles west. The crossing is shallow, knee-deep at the ford we've scouted. Grey Worm crosses 8,000 men while Tarly is focused on the Northern Army. The Unsullied emerge on the north bank behind Tarly's position. The Unsullied hit the flank. And the dragons? The dragons hit the siege equipment. Tarly has scorpions on the bank, the bolt throwers, the weapons designed to bring down a dragon. The scorpions are the threat. The dragons burn the scorpions before the scorpions fire. After the scorpions are ash, the dragons burn the supply wagons. After the supply wagons are ash, the dragons do nothing. The dragons circle. The dragons are the threat. The threat that says, surrender. The alternative to surrender is, the dragons stop circling, and start burning. Grey Worm assessed the plan. The assessment, the unsullied commander's evaluation of the river crossing, the flanking march, the timing that the coordination required. Grey Worm's assessment was the assessment of a man whose entire existence was the assessment of military plans, and whose existence had produced the ability to evaluate a plan in the time it took other men to understand it. The Ford, Grey Worm said. The voice that spoke the common tongue with the accent that Astapor had given him and that the freedom had not taken. The Ford is 5 miles. The march is 2 hours. The Northern Army holds for 2 hours. The Northern Army holds for as long as needed. Holding is what the North does. Holding against Tarly. Tarly is. Grey Worm searched for the word. The word was competent. The word was dangerous. The word was, this commander is not the commanders the Unsullied had fought in Slavers Bay, who were slavers playing at war. This commander was war itself. Tarly is skilled. Tarly is skilled. Robb is better. Daenerys said it. The statement, the wife's assessment of the husband's ability, spoken without hesitation, without qualification, without the diplomatic softening that a political statement would have received. The statement was not politics. The statement was belief. The belief was built on the reports she had read, the battles she had studied, the man she had married, and whose tactical mind she had watched operate in the war councils, and whose operation she had assessed with the Queen's eye. The eye that evaluated everything and that found, in Robb Stark's military mind, what the eye recognized, excellence. Better is a word that battles test, Grey Worm said. Then the battle tests it. The battle tested it. The Battle of the Blackwater Rush, the engagement that the Maesters would record as the first battle of the Targaryen Restoration, the first time since the Dance of the Dragons that dragonfire had been deployed in military combat. The battle began at dawn and ended before noon. It began with the feint. The Northern Army, banners flying, drums beating, the full spectacle of 22,000 men marching toward a river crossing that they had no intention of forcing. The Northern Army presented itself to Randyll Tarly's scouts, and Tarly's scouts reported, the crossing is coming. Tarly's defense focused. The 35,000 men on the north bank oriented toward the southern approach, the shields locked, the spears set, the scorpions loaded and aimed at the sky where the dragons would appear. The scorpions fired at Drogon. The first bolt missed. The miss was not incompetence. The miss was the impossibility of hitting a flying target with a weapon designed for stationary ones. The scorpion bolt, a shaft of iron the length of a man. The bolt flew past Drogon's wing by 3 feet, and the 3 feet was the margin that saved the Scorpion crew from immediate retaliation. And that did not save them from the second pass. Drogon burned the Scorpion line. 7 Scorpions on the north bank. 7 Scorpion crews, the men who loaded and aimed and fired the weapons that were the only defense against dragonfire. 7 Scorpions burned in 3 passes, 3 sweeps of the Black Dragon along the bank. 3 streams of fire that melted the iron and burned the wood and killed the crews who did not run and scattered the crews who did. The Scorpions were ash in 4 minutes. After the Scorpions, Drogon burned the supply wagons. The wagons lined behind Tarly's position. The food and arrows and material that the army required for sustained combat, the wagons burned with the speed that dragonfire applied to everything it touched. The burning was not combat. The burning was logistics, the destruction of the enemy's ability to sustain the fight. The fight continued. The sustainability did not. Rhaegal and Viserion circled. The 2 smaller dragons, the green and bronze and the cream and gold, the 2 dragons circled above Tarly's army and did not burn. The not burning was the threat. The threat was the message. The burning can expand. The burning is currently limited. The limitation is a choice. The choice can change. Tarly's army heard the message. Grey Worm's Unsullied struck the western flank at the 3rd hour. 8,000 Unsullied, the shield wall emerging from the tree line 5 miles upstream, the disciplined ranks pouring across the shallow ford and forming on the north bank with the speed and precision that the Unsullied applied to every maneuver. The formation was perfect. The timing was perfect. The flank attack hit Tarly's western line, while the western line was oriented south toward the feint, and the hitting produced what flank attacks produced when unexpected: collapse. Not immediate collapse. Randyll Tarly was too competent a commander for immediate collapse. Tarly recognized the flank attack and reoriented his western divisions and held the Unsullied for 40 minutes of brutal close-quarters fighting. The kind of fighting that the Unsullied excelled at and that Tarly's men endured, because Tarly's men were well-trained and because Tarly's command held them in place. But the hold was temporary. The hold was temporary because the Northern Army, the feint that was now the secondary attack, the Northern Army began crossing the rush at the 4th hour. Robb led the crossing. The king in the north, on horseback, in the river, grey wind swimming beside the horse, the northern soldiers pouring across the rush in the wake of their king. The crossing was no feint. It was the attack that the feint had become when Tarly's attention turned west. Tarly fought on two fronts: the Unsullied on the west, the Northerners crossing from the south, the dragons overhead, circling, the threat that limited Tarly's ability to concentrate forces, because concentration produced the target that the dragon's fire would exploit. 3 fronts, 2 armies, 3 dragons. Tarly retreated. The retreat was Tarly's masterwork, what separated a great commander from a good one. A good commander held until the holding broke, and the breaking was rout. A great commander recognized the moment before the breaking and converted the holding into orderly withdrawal. Tarly withdrew his army north, toward King's Landing, toward the walls that the dragons could burn but that the army could shelter behind, toward the defensive position that gave the Lannisters what the open field no longer provided: walls. The Battle of the Blackwater Rush was a victory. The victory was the marriage's first product, the first time the wolf and the dragon had fought together, the first time Robb's tactical planning and Daenerys' dragonfire had been applied to the same battlefield, the first time the alliance had produced a result. The result was, the alliance worked. The campaign continued. The campaign pushed north from the rush toward King's Landing. The campaign met resistance: Lannister forces defending the approaches, Tyrell cavalry screening the southern roads, the defensive actions that armies fought when the main force retreated and the rear guard held. The resistance was real. The resistance was also insufficient. Insufficient because every defensive position that the Lannisters established was a position that could be burned. And every burned position was a position that could not be held, and every position that could not be held was territory that the campaign claimed. The campaign reached the walls of King's Landing in 23 days. 23 days from the Blackwater Rush to the gates of the capital. 23 days of marching and fighting and burning and the steady, relentless advance that the combination of wolves and dragons and Unsullied produced. 23 days that changed the political map of Westeros, the map that had shown Lannister control from the Westerlands to the Crownlands, and that now showed Stark Targaryen forces camped outside the walls of the city that held the Iron Throne. King's Landing waited. The city, 500,000 people, the largest city in Westeros, the seat of power since Aegon had built it 300 years before, the city waited behind walls that Aegon had built to defend the dynasty, and that Aegon's descendant was now preparing to breach. The irony was architectural. The walls defended against the fire that the builder's blood had carried, and that the builder's heir now commanded. Robb and Daenerys stood on a hill south of the city. The hill, the vantage point that showed King's Landing spread before them, the Red Keep on Aegon's high hill, the Great Sept of Baelor on Visenya's hill, the Dragon Pit on Rhaenys' hill, the 3 hills that the 3 Targaryen siblings had claimed and named, and that the 3 Targaryen dragons now circled above. "There it is," Robb said, "the Iron Throne. There it is." Daenerys looked at the city that her ancestors had built and that her father had lost, and that she had crossed the world to reclaim. The sight struck her, hunger and fear and the weight of 300 years of Targaryen history pressing on the moment. The city is larger than I expected. Everything is larger than expected. The city, the war, the throne, the marriage, Daenerys looked at Robb. The looking that was the personal assessment. Wife looking at husband, the assessment that happened without the court's eyes, and that found, in the looking, what the marriage was producing. Familiarity. Not love, not yet, not the love that the songs described, and that Daenerys doubted, and that the marriage might or might not produce. Familiarity. The knowing. The knowledge of how the other person stood and spoke and thought. The knowledge that proximity produced and that proximity was the marriage's primary product. The marriage is the right size, Robb said. Is it? It will be. When we're done. When the city is ours, yours, and the war is over, and the alliance has produced whatever it produces. The marriage will be the right size. You're optimistic. I'm northern. We don't do optimism, we do endurance. The endurance says, we got this far. We keep going, keep going, keep going. Together, the siege of King's Landing began. The siege, what the walls could not hold. Inside the city, before the siege began, Varys had already done his work. The spider, the master of whisperers, the eunuch whose network of little birds carried information through the tunnels beneath King's Landing, with the speed and silence that Varys demanded. Varys had watched Cersei's preparations, and Varys had reached a conclusion. Cersei would burn the city before surrendering it. The wildfire caches, the caches that Aerys had placed beneath the city decades ago. The caches that Jaime had killed a king to prevent from being ignited. Cersei knew about the caches. Cersei had spoken about the caches. Cersei had used wildfire at the Blackwater. And Cersei, cornered, would use wildfire again. Varys contacted Tyrion. The contact was dangerous. Tyrion had been stripped of his authority after the Blackwater, his face scarred, his service unrecognized, his position reduced to the powerless younger brother whose father despised him and whose sister blamed him for existing. Tyrion had no army, no gold, no official power. Tyrion had one advantage. He knew the city. He knew the tunnels beneath it. He knew the people inside it, the gate captains and the gold cloaks and the servants whose loyalty could be purchased with promises and whose promises could be kept. And Tyrion had a motivation that outweighed his family loyalty. The city had 500,000 people in it, and Tyrion would not watch 500,000 people burn. The contact came through the tunnels. Varys brought the message to Tyrion's chambers in Maegor's holdfast, the message that said, "The Dragon Queen's army is coming. The Dragon Queen's husband is Robb Stark. The city will fall. The question is whether the city falls with fire or without it." Tyrion read the message. Tyrion calculated. Tyrion made the decision that Tyrion always made, the decision that chose people over family, survival over loyalty, the living over the dead. The siege of King's Landing lasted 11 days. The war had lasted longer, and the war had cost. Daisy Mormont fell at the crag, an arrow through the throat while securing the castle's surrender. Small John Umber died at the Green Fork, holding the line when the Lannister cavalry broke through. 300 Northerners buried between the Whispering Wood and King's Landing, their names recorded in the rolls that Robb carried and that Robb read every night, because the reading was the king's debt to the dead. 11 days, not the months that sieges traditionally required, not the slow starvation and the patient waiting that had characterized every siege in Westerosi history since the first men had built the first wall. 11 days, because the siege had dragons, and because dragons changed the mathematics of siege warfare the way the invention of the trebuchet had changed it. Completely, permanently, in the direction of the attacker. The first 3 days were negotiation. Robb's insistence, the king's demand that the city be offered terms before the burning began. The terms were delivered by Raven and by Herald, and by the simple, visible presence of 3 dragons circling above the walls like the eagles of death that the Valyrian poems described. The terms were surrender. Joffrey abdicates. Cersei submits to trial. The Lannister forces lay down arms. The city is spared. The people are spared. The Kingsguard and the City Watch join the Queen's service or depart in peace. The terms were generous because Robb had insisted on generosity, and because Daenerys had accepted the insistence because the insistence was the wager, the proof that conquest does not require cruelty, that the dragon can be merciful. The terms were refused. The refusal was Cersei's. Joffrey was, by the 11th day of the siege, irrelevant, the boy king whose authority had collapsed under the weight of the dragons that circled his castle, and whose mother had assumed the governance that the boy's incompetence had surrendered. Cersei refused because Cersei was Cersei, because the refusal was the Lannister response to surrender, the response that said, "Lions do not kneel. Lions fight." The fighting might be suicide. The suicide was preferable to the kneeling. "She's going to let the city burn," Tyrion said. Tyrion had saved this city once, at the Blackwater, with wildfire and a chain and tactical brilliance the Lannisters refused to credit. He did not want to watch it burn. Tyrion had contacted Robb. The contact, made through Varys through the Spider's network, was the betrayal that Tyrion had calculated and that Tyrion had justified with the justification that Tyrion always used. The calculus of survival. Cersei would not surrender. Cersei would let the city burn. The burning would kill thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. The burning was what Tyrion could prevent by opening the gate. The gate, Tyrion said, in the message. The message that Varys carried through the tunnels. The Western Gate, the gate of the gods. I can open it. How? I'm the most hated Lannister, which means I'm the only Lannister with friends in low places. The gate captain owes me his life. I saved his daughter during the Blackwater. He'll open the gate if I ask. The asking is the betrayal. The betrayal is the survival. The survival is the city. Robb considered the offer. Robb calculated, weighing the offer's value against the offer's cost, the offer's reliability against the offer's source. The source was a Lannister. The source was the Lannister who had been accused of killing Joffrey, the Lannister whose relationship to his family was the relationship of a man who loved the family but did not love him back. Trust a Lannister, the Blackfish said. The skepticism, the veterans' skepticism, built on decades of watching Lannisters maneuver and lie and betray. Trust this Lannister, Robb said. Tyrion Lannister saved King's Landing at the Blackwater. Tyrion Lannister governed the city better than any hand in memory. And Tyrion Lannister is offering to open a gate that will end the siege without dragonfire. The alternative to trusting him is burning the city. The alternative to trusting him is trusting the dragons. The dragons burn the walls. Behind the walls are 500,000 people. The people are not soldiers. The people are people, bakers and smiths and mothers and children. The dragons don't distinguish. The fire doesn't choose. If we burn the walls, the fire spreads. If the fire spreads, Daenerys said. The name that had become the shorthand, the word that summarized the argument against indiscriminate burning, the word that was the father's shadow falling across the daughter's campaign. Aerys, the mad king who had tried to burn King's Landing with wildfire, the father whose madness was what the daughter was fighting to redeem, the name that said, "We do not burn cities." Aerys, Robb confirmed. The fire that killed this city's people would be the fire that proved the Targaryens haven't changed. The fire would undo everything the campaign has built, every battle won without massacre, every surrender accepted, every story about the Dragon Queen who conquers without cruelty. One fire, one city, and the story changes from liberation to destruction. The gate, Daenerys said. We trust the imp. The gate opened on the 11th night. The gate of the gods opened in the pre-dawn darkness, opened by the gate captain whose daughter Tyrion had saved, and whose loyalty to the Lannisters had been weighed against the loyalty to the man who had saved his child, and the child's loyalty had won. The Unsullied poured through the gate. 8,000 Unsullied advanced through the streets in darkness, disciplined ranks that did not loot, did not burn, did not rape. Their orders were, the city lives. The people live. The enemy surrenders, or the enemy dies. The choice is the enemy's. The City Watch surrendered. The Gold Cloaks, the city's defenders. The men who had served the Lannisters not from loyalty, but from employment. The gold cloaks assessed the Unsullied pouring through the gate, and the dragons circling above, and the northern army approaching the walls, and the assessment produced surrender. The employment was not worth dying for. The gold cloaks laid down arms. The Red Keep held. The Red Keep held because Cersei ordered it held, and because the Kingsguard obeyed, and because the castle's walls were thick enough and high enough to resist conventional assault. The Red Keep did not resist dragons. Drogon landed on the walls of the Red Keep at dawn. The landing, the massive black dragon settling onto the battlements with the weight that cracked the stone, and the heat that melted the mortar, and the presence that produced in every defender on the wall the response that the response to dragons had always been: surrender or burn. The Kingsguard surrendered. All except Jaime Lannister. Jaime Lannister, who had killed Daenerys' father on this throne in this castle, and whose history with the Targaryens was the history of a sword that had cut the dynasty's throat. Jaime did not surrender, because Jaime was Jaime, the man whose relationship to surrender was the relationship of a sword to a sheath, what the sword went into when the fighting was done, and that the sword resisted when the fighting was not. Jaime fought. Jaime fought on the steps of the throne room, the steps where the Iron Throne sat, the steps where Jaime had killed Aerys. The steps that were the geographic center of everything that had happened and everything that was happening. Jaime fought Unsullied on the steps, and Jaime fought well, because Jaime Lannister was the finest swordsman in the Seven Kingdoms, and the finest swordsman on the steps of the throne room was the image that the singers would preserve. Robb stopped the fighting. Enough, Robb called. From the base of the steps. The king whose army had taken the city, whose wife's dragons had breached the walls, whose alliance had produced the victory that was now complete, except for the single Lannister knight who stood on the steps with a bloody sword and the expression of a man who was fighting not because the fighting could succeed, but because the fighting was the only language the man had. Left. Enough, Kingslayer. Don't call me that. I'll call you what you are. You killed the last Targaryen king. The new Targaryen queen is through that door. The symmetry is the world's joke. I killed the Mad King. The Mad King's daughter sends her husband to arrest me. The wheel turns. Heh, that's the phrase line. The phrase line fits. Everyone is the Frey eventually, selling what they have for what they need. I sold my honor for the city. What are you selling? I'm not selling anything. I'm asking you to put down the sword. Asking. Not ordering. Asking because. Robb paused. The pause. The king's pause. The pause that was not weakness. Thought. The thought that was. This man killed Daenerys' father. This man is Cersei's brother. This man is also the man who saved King's Landing from wildfire. This man is complicated. Asking because you saved this city once. The wildfire. The caches that Aerys planted. The caches that would have burned 500,000 people. You stopped that. You killed the king to stop that. The killing made you the Kingslayer. The saving made you something else. Jaime held the sword that was the extension of the arm, that was the extension of the man who had been the brightest knight in the Seven Kingdoms, and who had become the darkest, and who had spent 17 years carrying both, descriptions and knowing that only one of them was deserved, and that the one that was deserved was not the one the world had assigned. Something else. Something else. The something else is the reason I'm asking instead of ordering. The something else is the reason the Unsullied haven't killed you yet. The something else is you did the right thing once, in this room, on these steps, when no one else would. I'm asking you to do it again. Jaime lowered the sword. The lowering was surrender without defeat, arms laid down, not in loss but in recognition. The fighting was done. The war was done. The Lannister hold on the Iron Throne was done. And the man who had killed the last mad dragon was standing in the path of the new dragon, and the new dragon was asking him, not ordering, asking to step aside. Jaime stepped aside. The throne. What the Iron Chair demanded. Daenerys Targaryen sat on the Iron Throne on the 12th day. The culmination. The crossing, and the campaign, and the marriage, and the 300 years of exile that the sitting reversed. Daenerys sat on the throne that Aegon had forged from the swords of the conquered, and that her father had lost, and that her marriage, and her dragons, and her armies had recovered. She had come home. The sitting was also the beginning of the problem. The problem was the one that the marriage had deferred, and that the triumph now demanded, the question of the North. The question that Robb and Daenerys had agreed to table, the question that they had pushed into the future with the agreement that said, first the war, then the question. The war was over. The question had arrived. The question arrived in the form of the Greatjon. The North, the Greatjon said. In the throne room. The throne room of the Red Keep, the room that was now Daenerys' court, the room where the Queen sat on the Iron Throne and received the lords who bent the knee and the lords who did not bend the knee, and the lords whose bending or not bending would determine the shape of the realm that the war had created. The Greatjon did not bend the knee. The North does not kneel, the Greatjon said. The same declaration he had made at the crowning in Winterfell, repeated now in the throne room of the Queen his king had married at full Greatjon volume. We crowned a king in the North. The king married a queen. The marrying doesn't undo the crowning. Daenerys received the declaration. Daenerys received the defiance. It was not personal. The Greatjon did not hate her, but political. The marriage creates a union, Daenerys said. The union, the marriage, creates a family. Families have members. The North is a member of the family. The North is not a servant of the family. The distinction is what we negotiated. At Dragonstone, before the war, the negotiation was the negotiation. The war is over. The war changes the negotiation. How? The war was won by wolves and dragons. The winning was shared. The wolves did not fight and bleed and die from the Whispering Wood to King's Landing so that the North could kneel to a new queen instead of an old one. The wolves fought so that the North could be free. Free is the word. Free is the thing. Free means no kneeling. To anyone. The tension was the tension that the marriage had contained. The tension between two crowns, between two visions, between the Targaryen vision of a unified realm under one throne and the Stark vision of a North that governed itself. The tension had been deferred. The deferral was over. Robb entered the tension. Robb carried the king's burden, caught between the wife and the bannerman, between the queen and the lord, between the throne and the crown. Robb carried both, the Stark crown on his head and the Targaryen cloak on his back. That weight, shared, was marriage. The marriage was the carrying of two things that pulled in opposite directions and that the carrier held together through the force of will and the force of love. Jon, Robb said, to the Greatjon, the North is free. The North has always been free. The freedom didn't come from the crowning. The freedom came from the snow and the ice, and the fact that no southern army has ever conquered the North, because the North conquers every army that enters it. The freedom is geography. The freedom is winter. The freedom is not a crown. The crown is the symbol of the freedom. The crown is a circle of bronze on my head. The freedom is the North. And the North remains the North, whether the circle is on my head or in my saddlebag. The question is not whether the North is free. The question is whether the North is smart. Smart enough to see the advantage. The advantage is, my wife has 3 dragons. My children will have Targaryen blood. The North's future, the Stark future, the Winterfell future. The future includes dragons. Not because the dragons conquered us, because the dragons married us. The marriage turns the dragons from threat to asset. The marriage gives the North the weapon that every kingdom in Westeros fears and that no kingdom in Westeros can match. The weapon is also the leash. The dragons are hers. The throne is hers. The power is hers. What's ours? the North, the armies, the honor. The fact that every lord in the Seven Kingdoms respects the Stark name and trusts the Stark word, and that the trust is what the dragons cannot buy, and that the throne cannot command. The trust is ours. The trust is what we bring. The trust and the dragons together, the combination, is what no king in Westerosi history has held. The Greatjon wrestled. Wrestling was how the Greatjon thought, the physical man confronting the abstract argument, the process that was loud and visible and that ended, always in the Greatjon's version of resolution, the decision that the body made when the mind had exhausted its objections. The North stays free. The North stays free. Free means the Stark in Winterfell rules the North, not the throne, not the Queen. The Stark in Winterfell rules the North. The Stark in Winterfell, who is also the husband of the Queen. The Stark whose children are Targaryen. The ruling is not submission, the ruling is partnership. The partnership is the arrangement. I hate experiments. The arrangement has 3 dragons. That's the kind I can live with. The Greatjon's resolution was the resolution that the Greatjon always reached. The resolution of the man whose loyalty was to the Stark, and whose Stark had made a decision, and whose decision the Greatjon would support. Because the supporting was the loyalty, and the loyalty was the Greatjon's defining quality. The king in the North, the Greatjon, roared. In the throne room, in King's Landing, in the castle of the Targaryen Queen. The roar, the Greatjon's roar. The roar that had created the title in Winterfell and that now reaffirmed it in the capital. And the Queen on the Iron Throne. And the wolf and the dragon together. The roar echoed. The echo was the resolution. Not the perfect resolution. Not the resolution that either side had wanted, but the resolution that both sides could live with. The Greatjon roared for the king in the North, and the Queen on the throne, and the combination of the two was what the marriage produced. Not unity, but alliance. Not submission, but partnership. Not the ending of independence, but the beginning of something that independence alone could not build. Daenerys looked at Robb. She looked at him across the throne room, the Queen on the throne, the king standing before it, 2 crowns in one room. Your bannerman is loud, Daenerys said. All Northerners are loud. It's the wind. You have to shout to be heard over the wind. The wind in King's Landing is political. The shouting is louder. The resolution was formalized over the following days. Documents and declarations and public statements converted the Greatjon's roar into policy. The policy was, the North remained autonomous. The Stark in Winterfell governed the North with northern lords, northern laws, northern customs. The Iron Throne's authority reached the neck and stopped. Beyond the neck, the North governed itself. The autonomy was not full independence, and the distinction mattered, because it was the compromise, the place where 2 positions that could not fully agree found the ground that both could stand on. The North was part of the realm. The North governed itself within the realm. The realm included the North without commanding it. The taxes were negotiated, not imposed. An annual contribution from the North to the Crown, set by agreement between the Stark in Winterfell and the Iron Throne, revisable every 10 years. The contribution was not tribute. The distinction mattered because tribute was the payment of the conquered, and the contribution was the investment of the partner. The North invested in the realm. The realm invested in the North. The investing was mutual. The armies responded to request, not command. The Iron Throne could request northern soldiers. The North could say no. The saying no was the freedom. The freedom was what the Greatjon had roared about, and that the Greatjon's roar had preserved. The children inherited both. The firstborn child of Robb Stark and Daenerys Targaryen inherited the Iron Throne and the lordship of Winterfell. The second child inherited whichever the firstborn did not hold. The inheritance was the resolution, not in this generation, but in the next. The resolution was the children who carried wolf blood and dragon blood, and who would sit on both seats, and who would be, in their persons, the unity that their parents' generation had negotiated but not achieved. The resolution was imperfect. The resolution was imperfect Because every resolution between two powers was imperfect. Because perfection required one power to surrender, and neither power would surrender, and the not surrendering was what made the alliance real. Perfect alliances were not alliances. Perfect alliances were conquests disguised as agreements. Imperfect alliances. Alliances where both sides sacrificed and both sides gained, and neither side got everything. Imperfect alliances were the alliances that lasted, because the imperfection was the proof that both sides had been heard. Robb and Daenerys signed the document in the throne room. The king and the queen signed. The wolf and the dragon, married for strategy, victorious in war. Now governing for the future. It was the moment that the Maesters would record as the beginning of the new order. The new order was not the old order. The old order had been the Targaryen dynasty, one throne, 7 kingdoms, the dragon supreme. The new order was something else, something that did not have a name because the naming required time and the time was still accumulating. The new order was the dragon shares. The dragon shares not from weakness but from wisdom. The wisdom is sharing is what makes the throne sustainable. The throne that does not share is the throne that breeds rebellion. And the Targaryens who had learned the cost of rebellion the hard way, through fire and exile and 300 years of mistakes. The Targaryens had learned the lesson. In sharing it, they learned. And in the sharing, the marriage, the Sansa question. What the hostage cost and what the rescue proved. Sansa Stark was found in the Red Keep. Found, not rescued, since rescue implied danger, and the danger was over when the gates opened. Sansa was found in the chamber where Cersei had confined her during the siege, the chamber that was comfortable and that was also a prison, because comfort did not change the locked door, and the locked door was what defined a prison. Robb found her. Brother and sister, the Stark who had fought the war, and the Stark who had endured it, the reunion the war had deferred. The reunion that Robb had fought toward since the day his father was executed, and that the fighting had prevented, because the fighting was the instrument, and the instrument had not yet reached its target. The instrument had reached its target. Robb was in King's Landing. Sansa was in King's Landing. The distance was eliminated. The door was opened, and the brother walked through the open door and found his sister, and the finding was the feeling that the word reunion described, but that the word could not contain. The feeling that was larger than the word, that overflowed the word, that spilled from the word the way water spilled from a cup that was too small for the river that filled it. Sansa, Robb, the names that were the identity of family, the identity that said, we are Starks. We are the family that the world tried to destroy, and that the family survived because the family is older than the world's attempts to destroy it. The names were the shorthand. The shorthand was, I found you. You are safe. The war is over. Sansa cried. The crying released months of captivity. The months of performing for Joffrey and surviving Cersei and navigating. The politics of a court that wanted her dead or married or compliant and that got compliance, because compliance was the survival strategy that Sansa had learned, and that Sansa had perfected, and that Sansa would carry with her for the rest of her life, not as trauma, but as education. It's done, Robb said, holding his sister. He held her, the protection that politics had failed to provide and that a year of war had taken to deliver. The Lannisters are done. Father is, I know you know, but I need to say it. Father is avenged. Not perfectly, Joffrey lives. For now, because the Queen, my wife, the Queen has decided that Joffrey faces trial rather than execution. But the avenging is real. The Lannisters are broken. The throne is Targaryen. And you come home. Home, Winterfell. Home, the North. Where no one, home is, Sansa stopped. The stopping was what the captivity had produced, the habit of stopping before the words came, the habit of evaluating every sentence before the sentence was spoken, the habit of a girl who had learned that words in King's Landing were not communication, but weapons, and that weapons required aim. Home is going to be different. Home is going to be home. Home is going to be home with a Targaryen queen. Home is going to be home where the king in the north is married to the woman who sits on the Iron Throne. Home is going to be complicated, Sansa. I've lived complicated. Robb, I've lived in the most complicated city in the world for a year. I've survived complicated. What I'm saying is, I understand the marriage. I understand the alliance. I understand the experiment, the word that Sansa had heard in the court, the word that the court used to describe the Stark Targaryen arrangement. It's smart. It's necessary. It's also going to be very, very hard. Robb held the assessment. The assessment. Sansa's assessment. The assessment of a girl who had been naive when she arrived in King's Landing, and who was no longer naive because King's Landing had burned the naivety out of her the way the smith burned impurities from steel. Sansa's assessment was the assessment of a survivor. The survivor saw the alliance, and the survivor saw the complications, and the survivor's assessment was, the complications are real. The complications are coming. Prepare. You're different, Robb said. Everyone is different. The war changed everyone. The war changed you, king of nothing into king of the north. The war changed me, princess into prisoner, into whatever I am now. What are you now? Watching. I'm the Stark who watches. Father was the Stark who judged. You're the Stark who fights. Arya is the Stark who... Where is Arya? Safe, at Riverrun. With Mother. Bran and Rickon are at Winterfell, Sir Roderick holds the castle. Arya alive. Arya safe. Found by the Hound, found on the road, found in the chaos the war produced. The information landed and produced the second release. Not tears this time. The release was the exhale. The breath that the body had been holding since the day Sansa had watched Arya disappear in the crowd at Baelor's Sept, and that the body released now because the breath was the worry, and the worry was over, and the over was what the reunion produced. Safe. Safe. I promise. Don't promise. Just keep it true. Sansa met Daenerys the following day. The meeting was formal, the queen receiving the king's sister, the sister-in-law meeting the rescued hostage. The meeting was also assessment, two women evaluating each other across the gap that circumstance had created, and that the marriage had bridged, and that the women themselves had not yet crossed. Daenerys assessed Sansa the way Daenerys assessed everything, with the queen's eye. The eye that measured value and threat and alliance potential. Sansa was a Stark. Sansa was Robb's sister. Sansa was the girl who had survived King's Landing, and whose survival spoke to a quality that Daenerys valued above all others. Resilience. Daenerys valued resilience, because Daenerys was resilience. Resilience was the quality that had carried Daenerys from the Red Waste to the Iron Throne. And the recognition of that quality in others was the recognition of kinship. Sansa assessed Daenerys the way Sansa assessed everything, with the survivor's eye, the eye that had been trained in Cersei's court and that measured the person behind the crown and the power behind the person. Daenerys was beautiful. Daenerys was powerful. Daenerys was married to Sansa's brother. The assessment was, what does this queen want? And does what she wants align with what the Starks need? Lady Sansa, your grace. You're free. I've been told. The word is larger than I expected. Freedom is always larger than expected. Freedom is what confinement teaches you to want, and that wanting teaches you to fear, because the wanting has been so long that the having is unfamiliar. Unfamiliar. Yes, the unfamiliar is the proof that the freedom is real. If it felt normal, it wouldn't be freedom. It would be another kind of confinement. Daenerys looked at Sansa. Daenerys reassessed her, upgrading the initial evaluation from hostage to something else. Something sharper. Something that the captivity had produced, and that the captivity's ending had not diminished. You're observant. Observing is the skill that King's Landing teaches. The skill and the cost. What did it cost? The girl I was. The girl who believed in songs and princes and the stories that old Nan told. The girl who came to King's Landing thinking the world was the story. The world isn't the story. The world is what happens while the story is being told. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me since I took the throne. Honesty is the Stark inheritance. Robb got the honor. I got the observation. Between the two of us, we cover most of the truth. And the truth about this marriage? Your brother's marriage to me? Sansa considered. Sansa weighed honesty against diplomacy and found the Stark balance. Truth that did not wound but did not hide. The truth is, you need each other. The need is real. The love, if there is love, the love is growing. The growing needs protection. Not from enemies, from the throne. The throne breaks marriages because the throne demands everything, and marriages demand everything, and the everything of the throne and the everything of the marriage are not the same everything. The truth is, protect the marriage from the throne. If you can do that, if you can keep the throne from eating the marriage, then the marriage works. You call it that too. Everyone calls it that. The honesty is, it can succeed. It can also fail. The honesty is, nobody knows which one this is yet. Which one do you think it is? I think my brother chose well. I think you chose well. I think the choosing was smart, and the wedding was smart, and the war was smart. I think the question is not whether the choosing was smart, but whether the living, the daily living, the waking up and governing and disagreeing and compromising, and the 1,000 small negotiations that a marriage requires, whether the living is as smart as the choosing. The living is harder. The living is always harder. The choosing is a moment. The living is every moment after. Daenerys held Sansa's assessment. The holding, the queen holding the words of the king's sister. The words that were not flattery and not criticism, but the clear-eyed evaluation of a woman who had learned to see through deception because deception had been the medium in which she had lived. You should stay, Daenerys said. Not in King's Landing. I wouldn't ask you to stay in this city. But in the council, in the conversation, your eyes see things that mine miss. My eyes see things that everyone misses. That's the cost of King's Landing. The cost is, I can't stop seeing. Then see for us. See for the marriage. See for what we're building. I'll see, and I'll tell you what I see. Even when the seeing is hard. Especially when the seeing is hard. Sansa nodded, the Stark nod. Agreement without performance. I will do this because it needs doing, and because I am the Stark who sees, and the seeing is my contribution. Sansa saw. And what Sansa saw, in the weeks that followed, was what Sansa had predicted. The marriage was real. The arrangement was working. The work was daily, hard, imperfect, and real. The reality was the proof. The proof was, two people who had married for strategy were learning to live for each other. In the learning, they found the loving. And the loving proved the marriage's success. The success was fragile. The fragility was the condition. The condition was, success required maintenance. The maintenance was the daily work, the daily choosing to compromise, to listen, to bend without breaking. To carry two crowns on the same head and not let the weight of either crush the other. Robb and Daenerys maintained, and in maintaining it, the marriage held. The future. What the wolf Aeon, the dragon, built from the ruins of the old world, the realm that Robb Stark and Daenerys Targaryen built, was not the realm that either of them had imagined. Robb had imagined the North. Free, independent, governed by a Stark from Winterfell, separated from the southern kingdoms by the neck and the independence that the neck represented. Robb's vision was the vision of a boy who had grown up in his father's shadow and who had taken his father's death as the permission, the terrible, blood-soaked permission, to make the North what the Starks had always wanted and that 300 years of Targaryen rule had prevented, a kingdom. Robb's kingdom. The kingdom of the young wolf. Daenerys had imagined the throne, the Iron Throne, uncontested, unchallenged, the throne that was hers by blood and that she would claim by fire, and that she would hold by the combination of right and force that had defined Targaryen rule since Aegon. Daenerys' vision was the vision of a girl who had been told since childhood that the throne was stolen, and that the stealing was the crime that her life would correct. The correction was the return. The return was the restoration. The restoration was total. 7 kingdoms, 1 throne. The Targaryen wheel turning as the Targaryen wheel had always turned. Neither vision survived the marriage. The vision that survived was the third vision. The vision that the marriage produced. The vision that was neither Robb's nor Daenerys's, but the vision that emerged from the space between the wolf and the dragon. The space that the marriage created, and that the marriage inhabited, and that the marriage filled with the compromise that both of them had paid for, and that neither of them had wanted, and that both of them, in the end, recognized as something larger than either of their visions. The compromise was the vision. The compromise said, the North is free within the realm. The realm includes the North without commanding it. The throne governs 6 kingdoms through authority and 1 kingdom through partnership. The partnership is the marriage. The marriage is the bridge. The bridge connects what could not otherwise be connected: the wolf's independence and the dragon's sovereignty, the ice and the fire, the old gods and the new dynasty. The bridge held. Not without strain. The bridge strained every day. The bridge strained when northern lords complained that the taxes were too high, and southern lords complained that the taxes were too low. The bridge strained when Daenerys wanted to reform the laws of the North, and Robb told her the North's laws were the North's business. The bridge strained when Robb wanted to expand the Northern army, and Daenerys asked what the North needed an army for when the realm had dragons. The bridge strained, and the straining was the marriage, the daily tension of 2 wills pulling in different directions, and the daily resolution that the pulling produced, not breaking but bending, not collapse but accommodation. The accommodation that was what made the bridge a bridge and not a wall. Catelyn came south, Lady Catelyn Stark, the mother who had governed Riverlands during the war and who had travelled to King's Landing to see the marriage's result. The result was her son on a shared throne. The result was a Targaryen daughter-in-law. The result was grandchildren who would be half wolf and half dragon, and who would inherit both crowns. Catelyn assessed the result. Catelyn weighed everything against everything else, the way she always did. The assessment was, the marriage works. The marriage works because the 2 people in the marriage work. The work is daily and hard, and the hardness is the proof that the work is real, and that the people doing the work are committed to the doing. She's strong, Catelyn said. To Robb, in the chambers in the Red Keep that were Robb's chambers, the chambers of the king in the north, maintained in the capital as the symbol of the North's presence in the realm. Your wife. She's stubborn, strong. I said strong. You said strong. I heard stubborn. The words are close enough. The words are close enough because the quality is the same quality. The quality that built the alliance and won the war and holds the throne. The stubbornness is the strength. The strength is the stubbornness. And you, Catelyn looked at her son with the mother's look, the look that saw not the king, but the boy beneath the crown. You are equally stubborn, equally strong. The marriage of 2 stubborn people is either a disaster or a fortress. There is no between. Which one is ours? Ask me in 20 years. You sound like the Great John. The Great John and I agree on one thing. The verdict is pending. The verdict will be pending for as long as the marriage lasts. And the marriage lasting is what turns the pending into what? Into the answer. The answer to the question that the marriage asks. The question is, can the wolf and the dragon share a den? The answer is, the sharing is the den. The den is not a place. The den is the sharing itself. The act of sharing, the daily act, the constant act, the act that never stops and that never becomes easy and that never becomes natural. Because the wolf and the dragon are not natural partners, the act of sharing is what makes the den. You've thought about this. I've thought about this since you sent the raven, since the moment you decided to marry a Targaryen, the family that burned your grandfather and started the war that killed your uncle. Since that moment, I've thought about this, and the thinking has produced the assessment. And the assessment is, you chose well. The choosing was hard. The living is harder. But the choosing was right. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank the Blackfish. The idea was his. The idea was his. The decision was mine. The decision is always yours. That's the crown's weight. The crown says, the decision is yours, and the consequence is yours, and the credit, and the blame, and the everything that follows, everything is yours. Not everything. The everything is shared. That's the marriage. The everything is shared. Catelyn held her son's hand. The hold preceded the king, and would outlast the crown, the mother holding the child's hand, and the holding being enough, and the enough being everything. The realm continued. The realm continued because the realm had been built to continue, built on the compromise that both sides had paid for, built on the marriage that both people maintained, built on the daily, endless, exhausting work of governing two visions from one throne. The realm was not perfect. The realm was not the realm that Robb had imagined, or the realm that Daenerys had imagined. The realm was the third vision, the compromise between their visions, what the marriage made possible, and that only the marriage could sustain. Tywin Lannister died at Casterly Rock. Died. In the chair behind the desk where Tywin had governed the Westerlands for 40 years. The death was the death that Tywin had earned, quiet, private, surrounded by the gold and the stone that had been Tywin's gods. The death was also the end of the opposition, the end of the Lannister resistance, the end of the mind that had spent every moment since the fall of King's Landing calculating the alliance's weakness and planning the alliance's destruction and finding, in the calculating, what the calculating produced: nothing. The alliance held. The alliance held because the marriage held, and the marriage held because two stubborn people had chosen to hold it, and the holding was stronger than the calculating, and the calculating could not break what the holding sustained. Bolton died differently. Roose Bolton, the Pale Lord, the calculator, the man who had filed opportunities and measured loyalties and who had spent the war calculating the moment when betrayal became profitable. Bolton died at the Dreadfort, died of a fever. The death that was neither dramatic nor political. The death that said, some calculators die of what kills everyone, what the body produces when the body's time is done. Bolton died, and the filing died with him, and the opportunities that Bolton had stored, the opportunities that had never been profitable enough to act on, because the dragons changed the mathematics, the opportunities died unfiled and unacted upon and irrelevant. Bolton's death was the death of the alternative. The alternative had been, if the alliance fails, Bolton moves. The alliance did not fail. Bolton did not move. The not moving was the closest thing to loyalty that Bolton had ever produced. And the loyalty that was not loyalty but calculation, the calculation that said the alliance was stronger than the alternative, the loyalty was the proof that the alliance worked. It worked because it had dragons, because it had wolves, because it had two people who woke up every morning and chose not to love each other, not to agree with each other, not to surrender to each other, but to continue. Their continuing was the marriage, and the marriage bridged the realm. What if Robb Stark married Daenerys Targaryen? He married her not for love. Love came later, and the later was the surprise that the strategy had not predicted. He married her for the North, for the war, for the 3 dragons that changed the arithmetic of a conflict that the arithmetic had been losing. He married her because the Blackfish proposed it, and because Catelyn endorsed it, and because the Great John objected, and because the objection was the proof that the proposal was bold enough to matter. She married him not for the North. The North was one kingdom of 7, and Daenerys wanted 7. She married him for Westeros, for the foothold that the North provided, and the armies that the king commanded, and the honor, the Stark honor, the honor that was the family's currency, that the marriage purchased. She married him because Barristan counseled it, and because Jorah warned against it, and because the warning was the proof that the counseling was wise. They married for strategy. They lived for something else. The something else was what the marriage produced, what neither strategy nor politics nor the painted table at Dragonstone had predicted. The something else was 2 people who discovered in the daily work of sharing a war and a throne and a bed and a future, that the sharing was the point. Not the war, not the throne, not the strategy that had created the marriage. The sharing, the act of waking up beside a person who was a person you would never have chosen if choice were free, and discovering that the not choosing, the strategic choosing, the political choosing, the choosing that was not romance but calculation, the not choosing had produced a person worth choosing. The calculation became love. Not the love of songs. The songs got everything wrong, and the wrong was the song's purpose. Not the love of first sight. First sight had been the sight of two young rulers across a painted table, assessing each other for military value. Not the love that the world celebrated, the love that was passion and fire and the burning that consumed. The love that the wolf and the dragon built was different. The love was, I chose you for the wrong reasons, and the wrong reasons produced the right person. The love was, I married your army and discovered your mind. I married your dragons and discovered your mercy. I married the throne and discovered the woman who sat on it. The love was, you are not what I expected. You are better than what I expected. The better is the surprise. The surprise is the gift. The gift is the marriage. Robb Stark sat beside Daenerys Targaryen on the night that the realm's first year ended. Not on the throne, beside it. In the private chambers that the king and queen shared, the chambers that were neither northern nor Targaryen, but the third thing. What the marriage had created from the space between ice and fire. 1 year, Robb said. 1 year. Yes, yes, Daenerys looked at the king who was her husband, and the husband who was her king, and the man who was both, and neither and who was, in the privacy that the chambers provided, simply, Robb, the boy from Winterfell who had married the girl from exile and who had discovered, in the marrying, that the girl from exile was the partner that the boy from Winterfell had needed, and that the needing was the loving, and the loving was enough. Is it working? The realm hasn't burned. The north hasn't seceded. The dragons haven't eaten the direwolf. By those measures, yes, it's working. By other measures, Daenerys reached across the space between them. The reaching, the physical gesture that was the personal version of the political alliance, the hand extended not for treaty but for contact, not for negotiation but for something negotiations could never produce. The touch that said you are here, and I am here, and the here is shared, and the sharing is the point. By other measures, Daenerys said, it has exceeded every expectation. Robb took her hand. The king's hand held the queen's. The wolf held the dragon. Not the documents, not the vows, not the politics or the compromises, or the Great John's roaring, or Sansa's observation, or Catelyn's assessment. The hand, the holding. In holding each other, they held the realm. The realm was what no one had expected, what the strategy had not predicted, and that the politics had not planned, and that the alliance had not calculated. The realm was two people who had married for war discovering that the peace was worth more. Two crowns that had threatened to divide, discovering that the dividing was what made the unity possible. Two visions that had been irreconcilable, discovering that the irreconcilability was the foundation. Because the foundation of the best alliances was not agreement, but the stubborn willingness to disagree and continue. The wolf and the dragon disagreed. The wolf and the dragon continued. And so the realm continued.